Welcome, everyone, to the first annual Gap Year in Israel Mental Health Conference. Your time in Israel, for those of you who are students who are going to be attending a Gap Year program in Israel next year, whether your time in Israel is a 6-month program or staying for several years of learning or anything in between, that time is for many young people a first real foray into independent young adulthood. Therefore, it is an opportunity for amazing growth and development. And we at Refuat Hanefesh salute you and your parents for deciding to spend the first year you have post-high school learning and growing in Israel, our Jewish home. We are sure that with proper planning, the support of your parents, and the amazing staff at each of the programs participating today, you will have a truly formative year. That being said, like all significant developmental milestones, this year comes with some challenges, many of them emotional or social. And being prepared to understand yourself, to know about available resources, and to be ready to seek help when you need it will help you have a successful experience. We are incredibly grateful to Kavla Noar, Machon Devir, and Get Help Israel, 3 wonderful mental health organizations in Israel who are partnering with us in creating this program. We are also grateful to our additional presenters, Dr. Yael Muscat, Dr. Shalamis Pollack, and Mendel Horowitz, as well as our panels of recent Gap Year alumni who will be sharing with you today. The fact that 33 high schools and 27 Gap Year programs have co-sponsored this program demonstrates that each of them deeply understands the importance of helping young adults learn about their mental health and cares deeply about providing each of you the best and healthiest experience during your Gap Year. So whether you have never experienced any concerns about your mental health, but just want to make sure you are prepared for the ups and downs of a transitional year, or if you have a mental illness or disorder and want to plan for the best way to manage it while away from home in a new country, today's program is going to be very helpful to you. We are going to begin our program with a short video presentation, which will help you get a window into the lives of young people during their Gap Year, experiencing their mental health and development during that time.
My name is Elisa Makovsky. I went to Midreshet Nishmat for my Gap Year in 2017.
Hi, my name is Nachum Goldstein. I went to Yeshivat Har Etzion in 2016.
My name is Helen Stepa, and I attended Midreshet Lindenbaum beginning in the fall of 2015.
Hi, my name is Hannah Ross. I went to MMY in 2016.
Hey guys, I'm Max Engel, and I went to Mevaseret in 2017 and 2018.
My name is Lizzie Jansen. I went to Migdal Oz in the year 2017 to 2018.
When I was in high school, I experienced some mental health challenges. I received some diagnoses, and I started taking medication and going to therapy. And by the time I graduated, I felt pretty confident that I was stable and that I was able to keep everything under control. I didn't feel like I needed to do anything to prepare for my year in Israel other than make sure I would have my medication. I did not plan to have a therapist or any external support.
Coming into the year, I was full of motivation, wanting to continue to grow, to succeed spiritually, to continue developing my learning and my tefillah. But over the course of the winter, I started to realize that those thoughts of wanting to develop, of inspiration, of motivation, over time began to grow into thoughts of self-criticism. I was being very hard on myself. I wasn't really able to learn properly or daven properly, because every time I tried to open a sefer, I would say to myself, you're not doing well enough. Those thoughts that I thought in the beginning were coming from a good place, from a place of wanting to improve and to develop spiritually, were in fact rooted in a form of OCD.
I have struggled with mental health and various neurodivergencies essentially since birth, and by the time I began seminary, I had been in therapy for about 4 years and seemed to be doing better. I incorrectly hoped that I would not need mental health support during my Gap Year. Just because this is meant to be a fun year doesn't mean you don't need or deserve support.
I am diagnosed with generalized anxiety and panic disorder. Going to MMY was probably the hardest thing I've ever done in terms of anxiety. I was terrified in the months leading up to it, and my first few months there was really, really hard. I was anxious, I was scared, I was homesick. I have IBS, and I was genuinely very, very sick when I was there.
I deal with anxiety and OCD, and I had been seeing a therapist years before I went to yeshiva. When I decided to go to yeshiva, I thought that it wasn't necessary to see a therapist, so for the first year I didn't, but I struggled with mental health.
I had seen a therapist in high school and was taking medication for anxiety. So I decided to be really proactive in researching therapists and psychiatrists for when I got to Israel. In the beginning of my year, I was never happier. A real turning point for me was when I went to Poland. I was a really picky eater, and in Poland there wasn't food for me to eat. Also, on the bus we would watch Holocaust movies, and I didn't feel like watching one of the movies, so I watched a movie instead which featured a girl struggling with an eating disorder. In that vulnerable state, I decided I would be like the girl in the movie. When I got back from Poland, I stopped eating meals. I would spend my lunchtime napping or working out, telling myself what I was doing was okay, because a popular diet at the time was intermittent fasting.
When I got to seminary, pretty quickly it became obvious that I needed a little more support. Stopped sleeping. For the first few weeks I was there, I started experiencing panic attacks, which was something new for me.
I did fall into a very deep and messy and difficult depression during my time in Israel.
My friends noticed, and the director of my program noticed that I had lost weight. We decided I should switch therapists to one who specialized in eating disorders. I was told I had anorexia and something called orthorexia, which is an obsession with health and clean eating. Unfortunately, I could not stay in Israel to receive treatment for my mental health conditions. I had to go home, and I think it's okay if the time comes where you're really, really struggling and it's not safe for you to stay in Israel. I think it's okay to accept that decision.
Over time, I was able to learn how to distinguish between thoughts that were coming from a good, healthy, solid place of wanting to improve in a positive way versus thoughts that were just putting me down, and they were rooted in that place of anxiety. And had I known before my year how to be able to distinguish between those thoughts, I think my whole process of change and of development would have been a lot more smooth, a lot more healthy.
I reached out to my family and my psychiatrist back home to kind of talk about what was happening, and then with their encouragement started seeing a therapist and putting in that time every week, showing up to therapy, making sure that I was staying on top of my medications. Having just that support was crucial to my success that year, and it was because of that I was able to stay and I was able to enjoy it.
With the help of a local psychiatrist who ensured that I was consistent with my medication, and with a really strong support group of friends, and of course having my family back home, I was able to stick it out, and I had a really, really terrific year. It was totally worth it. I'm so glad that I stayed.
My gap year was not the best year of my life, but I did make some incredible bonds, and I can honestly say that I would not be who I am today without my experience in Israel. I did actually come home early. I ended up volunteering in a museum, and it totally changed the course of my life. It's okay if you need to come home. It's okay if you need to switch programs. And it's okay if you genuinely do have a blissful, amazing, meaningful year.
To an incoming gap year student, I would say, don't do it alone. The people at your program have seen this before. They know the professionals in Israel. You can be open with them. I would also say it makes a lot of sense that this year is when mental health conditions come up. Talk to your friends. Chances are you're not the only one who feels lonely or anxious sometimes.
My second year, I did see a therapist, and it helped a lot. I want to encourage everybody to see a therapist whether or not they struggle with mental health, and especially the year in Israel where it's many times people's first time on their own and they're finding themselves.
I was able to come out of it and say that not only did I survive, but I had an amazing, amazing experience, and I would absolutely do it all over again, anxiety included.
I'm so thankful for the fact that I was able to find that support and start therapy in Israel. And it really encouraged me to realize that I have control. I have the ability to get myself help regardless of where I am, and it's a lesson that I've taken with me into college. I'm thankful that I had the opportunity to spend a year in Israel learning. I had a wonderful, wonderful time. I made lifelong friends, and I wouldn't have been able to do it without reaching out, without asking for support.
Now ready to head to our first presentation, which is going to be something really important for us to hear. I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Shmuel Harris, who over the course of the last few months has become a cherished colleague and friend. And Dr. Harris is the founder and director of Machon Devir, one of our sponsoring organizations this afternoon, a wonderful mental health organization clinic in Yerushalayim that specializes in DBT therapy. And he is a working psychiatrist with many years of experience working with yeshivot and seminaries and students in those programs. He is also the co-author of an upcoming book, Nafshi B'She'ilati, together with Rabbi Yoni Rosenzweig, talking about halachic issues related to mental health, which we look forward to seeing come out very soon. And at Machon Devir, over the last number of years, he and his team conducted really important and some of the most recent and detailed research into the mental health of gap year students, and really has a very deep understanding of the experience of our young people as they go through their gap years. So we're really excited that he's going to present those research findings today with us and really help us get a broad understanding of the experience of the gap year in Israel. So with that, I turn over the floor to Dr. Harris to share with us.
Thank you very much, Rav Noam, and thank you really to Refuat Hanefesh for putting this together. I think it's clear after that extremely powerful intro video, which I've not seen before, and despite my familiarity with this population, to really see it put together like that is very touching and very moving, and I think really drives home how important a conference like this is for all of us, participants and also clinicians, and the work that we're doing. So I'm hoping that really throughout this wonderful conference, it'll be genuinely helpful, the information that's been given over, to make sure that it's a successful and an emotionally healthy year. I'll talk a little bit about the research that we've been doing for the past few years, looking at mental health among Israel gap year students. Okay, so just a brief history about how we even got into doing research, and really some of the exciting and unexpected results that you get when you start looking at data and numbers and try and get a big picture view of what's happening. Around 10 years ago, when I was heading up the psychiatric service in Hadassah at Mount Scopus and working informally in a private capacity with Dr. Tzachi Fried, it became clear to both of us that there were an increasing number of gap year students who were coming into the emergency room with complex and higher risk presentations, and that the schools ultimately did not feel comfortable keeping in Israel. And in many cases, neither did the students and neither did the parents. These students were struggling in regulating emotions and with other mental health issues, and were engaging in behavior that was interfering with their ability to function productively in seminary, in yeshiva, or in whichever gap year program they happen to be in. From a clinical perspective, these were actually students that we thought could stay here. Not only could they stay here, but they really should be able to stay here and would benefit from a service that had a team working together and the option of providing medication management where that was necessary, and could also provide students with the support that they needed, while just as importantly, reassuring the parents and the schools that they could actually stay with this type of support. And so over the past 5 years, this has been the central mission, or one of the central missions that we've been doing at the clinical service at Machon Devir. Once we'd actually set up the clinical service, we realized that we needed to better understand this population, to better identify, to qualify, and to quantify what was going on with the gap year population during the year here, and to continue to track this over a number of years. The logic behind it being that we wanted to better identify the services and support that the population of the gap year students specifically required. And so that led us to establish the research project towards the end of 2017, and the importance of the study was actually recognized by the government of Israel, and they awarded us a grant through the Ministry of Absorption and Aliyah in order to fund the research. It should be made clear that the study, the research, does not identify any individual student, nor does it even identify any specific school, be that yeshiva, seminary, or other program, but it looks at the gap year population as a whole. And these results are essential not only for our own clinical service at Machon Dvir, but really for the wider mental health community here, and along with the various schools in Israel and back in the US. And to that end, since we've been running the study, we've been doing a number of presentations such as this one and workshops in order to get the research out and so that people know what it is that this population requires and needs. Let's take a look at some overall numbers, and I'll try and keep this simple and straightforward, nothing too complex. But if there are questions, I think we'll do that at the end. So far there's been over 500 questionnaires administered. That I know for sure, because I just saw one of our research clinicians this morning who'd come back from 2 yeshivot with probably a bundle of around another 100 questionnaires. So this is something that is current and ongoing and recent. We don't have the results of those questionnaires yet, but hopefully by next time we'll have them and some others. Approximately 40 schools have been involved, a mixture of seminaries and yeshivot, but with a predominance of seminaries at this stage. It could be that maybe the seminaries are a little bit better organized and it's easier for us to facilitate the giving of the questionnaires. The results are from 2017, 2018, and 2019. 2020 was a tricky year, as we all know, and not being able to really go and visit schools during quarantine and whatnot made it very tricky for us to run the questionnaires. But as mentioned, 2021, we are going to have some results from that, and that's been already happening over the past few days. So what did we look at? There's a few things that we looked at, and I'm going to look at the ones in red. I'll go into a little bit more detail, but we used something called the CCAPS, which I'll describe in a moment. We did a self-injury questionnaire, screen time and sleep time, very important and relevant. The use of alcohol and other substances, looking at a measure of loneliness on during the gap year, and also experiences with therapy. So firstly, to the CCAPS. The CCAPS was the basis of our survey, primarily because this is a really well-tested and validated screening measure that was used on over 400,000 college campus students in the United States. So we're talking about enormous numbers, which gives us a good level of certainty and confidence that this is a good screening tool and it can show us what it is that we're looking for and it's accurate. And also tells us what is statistically normal and what's no longer statistically normal as well, which is important. Otherwise, we can just end up diagnosing everybody with everything. So we need to know, have an idea of what's considered normal. Importantly, it is multiculturally valid. What that means is it was tested on a number of different people of differing backgrounds. And that, of course, is important to make it relevant to a Jewish population, to a seminary yeshiva population, and also to a general gap year population. And there are actually a number of similarities, if we think about it, that makes it very relevant to a gap year population, in the same way that college students in the US, as opposed to Australia, where I'm from, college students will often leave their families and go overseas, not overseas, interstate, sorry, to different states, different universities or colleges. And that's certainly the case. Gap year students coming from overseas in a new environment, a new school, living outside of the family structure for an extended period of time with unfamiliar roommates often, a strict academic framework, and also, of course, maybe one of their first tastes of proper independence. So that's really very, very relevant to what the CCAPS looked at as well. It should be noted, it's a screening tool. The screening tool is not diagnostic. We do not diagnose mental health issues through the CCAPS, but it can give us a pretty good indication of who is likely to qualify for a diagnosis or which people really need intervention, therapeutic or otherwise. And lastly, and not leastly, it's very easy to administer. So when doing research, we like to keep things simple, straightforward, and not too complicated. An example of some of the subscales. Now, again, these are not diagnoses. These are just subscales that the tests look at, that the CCAPS looks at. Depression, Generalized anxiety, which is the sort of the palpitations and racing thoughts and tension and flashbacks and getting easily startled. Then you've got social anxiety, stress over the ability to make friends, feeling self-conscious, discomfort around people, fear of speaking in front of people. Academic distress, which I think was also highlighted as well in the intro video, but strict academic frameworks and with expectations of having to perform, and that's certainly very, very true in the seminary, particularly in yeshivas as well, where we like to put a lot of emphasis on academic excellence. Realistically, I mean, that starts before they get to Israel and it continues afterwards as well. Eating concerns, family concerns, hostility, hostilities, anger, being irritable, not being able to control emotions, and substance use. So we'll look a little bit more of just some basic questions here. What it asks, for instance, there are scales that have a sentence and then you have to rate how much you agree or disagree with it on a 5-point scale. So I get sad or angry when I think of family. I feel disconnected from myself. I'm anxious that I might have a panic attack, difficulty controlling temper, concerns that other people don't like me, drinking more than I should, not being sufficiently motivated for classes, and the less I eat, the better I feel. And so it's called the CCAP 62 because there are 62 questions that look at these various subcategories that we described before. What did we find? So 60%, if you look at the overall population, meaning seminary and yeshiva students, reported high levels of distress with a potential for diagnosis in at least one subscale. And so basically looked at, there was something called high levels of distress and then moderate levels of distress. And then there was anything that was mild or beneath that was not considered to qualify. But we're looking at 75%, 2/3 of students had some moderate level of distress in one of these 8 subscales. And that meant that there would be some that would be consistent for some sort of an intervention, a need for treatment in at least one subscale. What that treatment is, for some people, it might be a very short course of therapy, several weeks. For other people, it might actually just be speaking to someone who has some mental health, emotional health experience within the school. And for other people, it means something more formalized, a longer form of therapy, or even looking at psychiatric treatment together with the therapy. When we take a look overall at the numbers, so it means that 90% of all students reported moderate to high distress in at least one category. And I should say that this is something that was consistent across years. When we're looking at 2017, 2018, 2019, these numbers are fairly consistent without a big change in the numbers. So let's break it down a little bit into the main categories that we saw that were relevant. So if we take a look, first of all, at depression, divided into yeshiva and seminary, around 25% altogether of yeshiva students had either a moderate or a more severe form of depression. Again, it's not a diagnosis, but the depression subscale, moderate or high levels of distress. 3/4 did not. And in the case of seminaries, it was really closer to, over actually 1/3, a little bit more than 1/3 as opposed to 1/4, whereas 2/3 did not have that. And that's something that we actually see is consistent. I will just briefly mention, when we compare this to the CCAP's control study, the CCAPs actually had higher levels of depression when they did their tests on the 400,000 people. But that really makes sense because the CCAPs was being run in counseling centers on campus, which means that people needed to turn up to the counseling centers. Anyone who had already turned up was considered to be a clinical population. They were looking for some sort of an intervention. Whereas this study that we did was done on a non-clinical population. It was done on all seminary and yeshiva students, regardless of whether they had a history or they were having problems or they didn't. We were looking at the entire population overall. So we really would expect that our numbers would be lower than what we would see in a clinical population, such as what was used in the control sample in the CCAPs. Generalized anxiety, we actually found in both generalized and, as you'll see after, in social anxiety, higher levels than depression. Both of them are sort of already creeping up to almost 50% having some sort of moderate or high distress. And it's almost identical, the numbers in yeshiva and seminary, when it comes to generalized anxiety. Very, very similar numbers. And when we look at social anxiety, again, slightly lower in the yeshivas than the seminaries. Social anxiety in terms of making friends, public speaking, performing in social settings was a little bit less prevalent in the yeshivot than in the seminaries, but was still fairly prevalent, and it was creeping up close to the numbers that we saw in a clinical population in the CCAP study. So that's something that's really quite significant and important to pay attention to. The next slide that I'm going to show you is really something that caught us unprepared and unexpected, and that was eating concerns. Eating concerns, we know from studies done in the US that Jewish and specifically Orthodox communities have higher levels of eating concerns. That could be partially because it's one of the ways that's acceptable in order to, if we're looking at, for instance, shidduchim, but even not looking at shidduchim, substance abuse is much less common in the study that we looked at, but food and food restriction or dysregulated eating or eating concerns or how people look is actually a lot more acceptable as a way of controlling distress in these areas. What's really fascinating, however, is that there was a high level of eating concerns amongst yeshiva students than there was amongst seminary students. And that really we did not expect. And it shows us, again, the importance as researchers and in general of not making assumptions that aren't necessarily supported, and really being surprised that, yes, also yeshiva bochrim can very much be affected by these eating concerns. In fact, if we take a look at the next slide as well, these were the questions that were asked, some of the questions in the subscale. I purge to control my weight. The less I eat, the better I feel about myself. I think more about food than I would like to. And if we take a look at the numbers here, what we found, I am dissatisfied with my body shape. 51% of the yeshiva population that we looked at was dissatisfied with their body shape. Now, that might be because they don't feel that they're quite muscly enough or that they're overweight, but there was definitely a concern about body shape that was statistically more significantly larger than what we saw amongst the seminary students. And we know that seminary students, that eating concerns are a concern that people deal with during the year away. If we look at the next one, is substance abuse. No real surprises here, really quite low, much lower, almost half of what we would expect to see in a college population. And that's even taking into account the fact that this is their first taste of freedom. For many students, when they come to Israel, they're legally allowed to drink, especially if they're coming from states in the US where the drinking age is 21. In Israel, it's 18. And so you would expect that there is going to be some sort of experimentation that's happening here as well, and yet it is still significantly lower than what we see in other populations, in the college population. But we have to see what the emerging trends are and how that plays out, and that's the reason why we are doing the ongoing study to see if these numbers change and it becomes more of a significant issue. Critical items looked at thoughts of ending life, thoughts of hurting others. These were really quite low, and again, much lower than what we saw. This specifically wasn't asked in the CCAPs. This was a separate questionnaire that we asked, but it was lower than what we would have expected to see in a general population of this age. What wasn't lower, however, is that even though suicidal ideation and thoughts of harming others are relatively rare, NSSI, what we call non-suicidal self-injury, that's people who hurt themselves not in order to kill themselves, chas v'shalom, but in order to feel better, to regulate themselves, to often physical pain is a lot easier to deal with than psychological pain. And that's certainly true in terms of when people feel that they need to be punished, for instance, that they'll engage in self-harm as well. That is something that we actually do see, and it's not so rare. So if we take a look, the question that we asked is, have you ever intentionally caused yourself harm? And looked both ever before they even got to Israel and also during their period of time in Israel. And the number that we got was 16%. That was consistent with the rate amongst US adolescents, which is 15 to 20%. It really falls into that bracket, that those numbers. 16% of seminary students reported to have self-harmed. Of these, half reported injuring themselves during the seminary year. So that means, 8% of them, or still 50% of them, who had injured themselves at any time in the past, whether it was 1 year, 10 years, 15 years ago, whenever it was, but half of them were still using self-injury as a form of coping mechanism while they were here. And so that's also something very important for us to be aware of and to be asking and following up. In terms of impairment, and when we think fundamentally, why are we spending so much time talking about all of this? At the end of the day, students are not coming across in order to do therapy, but they're coming across to learn, to grow, to develop. And what gets in the way of them being able to do that is not, an infected left toe in most cases, although that can happen, but it's mental health issues and it's emotional health issues. And that's why it's so important that we're really on top of these things even before they get here. 16% of seminary students said it strongly interfered. 20% of yeshiva students said that their issues strongly interfered in order to be able to benefit from their year away. And I think that's why, being forewarned is forearmed. That's the expression, or maybe, that we make sure that we're prepared and that we can really help the students be as prepared as possible. If we take a look, these are the last few slides of over the course of the year, what happened to people's problems. So we did both entry and exit surveys, looking at when people first got here and what was going on, and also at the end of the year, what happened. And so this was really important. We ran this both on seminary and yeshiva students, even though the numbers for yeshiva students really weren't sufficient for us to have any real statistical confidence about the data. But we could definitely do that with the seminary students, where we were talking about close to 300 students. And the vast majority we can see improved. Some stayed the same, some went up, fluctuated. Around 8% either began or worsened. This is important. Around 8% of issues only begin during the gap year. It means that the vast majority of issues do not begin when they get here, but they're already known before. And for those issues, we can really prepare and put things in place. It's the other 92%. That's 92%. It's this 8% that it's a little bit trickier because they only start here. But really, the vast majority of issues start well before they get here. And so we do have time and the framework and the ability to set up things in advance. If we break it down and take a look at these numbers here, of the students who actually went to therapy, what did it look like? What happened to their problems over that year? So we can see that 25% of the seminary students that we looked at were in therapy, and over 55% of them improved. We had a much lower number, probably around 8% that worsened and around 20% that stayed the same. So that's a very impressive number in terms of over 50% really improved with that. Again, we'd love to break these numbers down even more this year, looking at teletherapy versus in-person therapy in general. And as therapists and mental health clinicians, we really prefer to meet people face to face. That's one of the beauties of the mental health profession, is it's one of the last areas where you get real, genuine one-on-one time with people and uninterrupted. And having that over Zoom is obviously much more challenging, but there's certain advantages as well in terms of accessibility and allowing more people maybe to get access to it and not having to travel. But fundamentally, these are very reassuring numbers that we saw that, for those who are in therapy, they improved, and they improved during a year that is challenging academically, that's challenging socially, that's challenging in terms of family as well, and in terms of their self-growth, both personally and religiously, and in many other areas as well. So I will finish off by just a thank you to all of the people who were involved and are still involved in this ongoing study, Dr. Fried up the top there, and Dr. Lane, and two of our other clinicians. And yeah, this is the team now. So happy to answer if we've got a few minutes for questions, but of course the email's down the bottom there. So if there are more questions that we don't get through, if people just want to reach out and get more info, please feel free to do so.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Harris, for that very informative presentation. Let me give you a couple of the questions that we have coming in. They're coming in fast and furious. Okay, so if I'm skipping your question, it's likely because one of the presenters coming up next is most likely to address it. But let me ask you this, Dr. Harris. Somebody asked, how much training do the yeshivot and seminaries have for spotting the signs of mental health issues among their students?
That's a wonderful question. And I think it's something that's changing from year to year. There's much more awareness of the importance of mental health issues for the schools, and that they have some sort of an awareness, even at the level of whether it's a madrichim, madrichot, and aim by the faculty members already being able to identify certain signs. Through YU, for a number of years, we were running workshops at the beginning of the year for madrichim, madrichot, and the school staff as well, to really help them get more familiar. One of the big challenges in mental health, in everything, but in particular with mental health, is knowing in terms of boundaries and, you know, what your area is and when you need to refer on and to give it over to other people. And so really the goal of the trainings and the workshops that we've done and other people have done, you know, over the various years has been to give them a little bit of first aid understanding what to do, and to understand when is an issue that really needs to be referred on to a professional. So I think that there's a lot of room to be hopeful. Hopeful. A lot of room to be hopeful with the schools, because people really are a lot more open and interested. And the schools themselves know now that these are genuine issues that they're dealing with and have known for a long time already. And I think it's becoming a lot more acceptable to be able to reach out and to get help. So I think that the situation's definitely improving, and the staff are becoming a lot more aware and in tune with it.
And I can just add, if I may, to that, you know, I've been talking to these 27 different programs that have sponsored today, and all of them have expressed that they themselves have continued to add programming, educational programming, as well as training for their staff over the last number of years, and that they continue to be actively seeking ways to improve the offerings that they have for their staff and for their students. So I definitely agree. From my view, having worked with these programs who have joined us this morning, with that hopefulness that many, many programs are actively involved in seeking the information and guidance and expertise that they need to best care for your children. Okay, let's go with several of these questions are questions which are specifically going to be answered in the breakout session. I'll just have Dr. Harris leave us with this. Somebody was wondering the degree to which selection bias or response bias might have impacted the results that you found, in that you know, the students who chose to respond to your questionnaires were students who had more likely than the general population to have particular mental health concerns.
This sounds like someone who's involved in research a little bit and understands that it's a great question. First of all, the research that we ran, nobody had to do it. It was out of choice. We did try and encourage people to do it. We offered them, you know, we did like a raffle lottery that you could go get for a restaurant or for waffle bar. We did to try and encourage people to do it, but it was completely anonymous and it was not forced. It was people chose to do it. It's interesting, I didn't present it here, but one of the things that we looked at is how honestly people actually answered the questions. Now you could argue, well, how can you check that? Because how can you ask somebody if they're answering honestly or not? They're not going to answer dishonestly and then that answer honestly. But we really did get a good idea that we think that these results are fairly consistent and reflective, because we see from year to year, they really stay pretty much the same at the moment. And so if we expected, that they were totally off, we'd see that 1 year. The other thing that sort of protects any type of study is numbers. The more numbers that you have in any research that you do, you're always going to have selection bias, and you're always going to have all sorts of biases that are introduced. The more numbers that you have, those biases become less and less significant. And so that's why once we've got larger numbers, then it makes sense and we've got more confidence in the statistical truth and significance of what it is that we're seeing. And an example is by therapy. We had too few numbers by the yeshiva students, and it didn't make sense, the scales that we were seeing. So that's why we have to say we can't actually include it, because it doesn't statistically make sense. But the more numbers we get, the more confidence we can have in what it is that we're seeing. I think that's the bottom line.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. And sorry to have to cut off this part of the presentation, but we have many more important presentations to go. The adults are going to first hear from Dr. Yael Muscat, who's going to address the questions of really understanding this developmental period in young people's lives and what kinds of things to expect to see happening in them as they grow and develop into young adulthood, and when to know when those things need what kind of support. Followed by Tanya Pruchko, who's going to answer all of your questions about the real practical details of how to access the help and support that students need while they're in gap year in Israel, everything from the finding a therapist to the insurance issues, as well as Dr. Harris will help address any medication issues that come up in that session as well. And the young adults the men are going to first hear from Mendel Horowitz, who has joined our team with a little bit late with a last minute cancellation. Ellie Rothstein from Kav Lenoir was unable last minute to be with us, although Kav Lenoir is still an important partner with us in this program today. He will be addressing some of those issues about your development and growth and how to understand where you are as a developing young adult for the young men themselves. And Dr. Shalamis Pollack will be addressing that same issue for the young women. And following that, I really encourage the students who are with us to hang around for the third presentation, which is going to be a panel of young alumni to hear from peers of yours who are really only 2 or 3 years past their own gap year experiences, to talk about what their experiences were like. And I think that will really help give you a sense of what you can expect and what can it feel like from your level of perspective.
Come back from Israel very much having been nourished from their experience, no matter what the experience was. And I think another very important thing to note is, some of the words that Dr. Harris said, which was very, very interesting, could sound very sobering, but the reality is that sometimes growth comes through hard things. And if we look at the overall, students coming back from Israel this year, they're starting to sprinkle back now. Most of them had quite a remarkable, and they would say enjoyable year. And if they could enjoy an experience in Israel with coronavirus and then the ending, with what happened in Meron and the war that's going on there, if they could somehow squeeze an enjoyable year out of that, I think we can all know that, with what the schools have to offer and everything that's set up for them, they're going to have an enriching and important and wonderful experience. So I'm going to start with just 3 short vignettes of people that we see at the counseling center coming back to us. Now, what I will tell you, at the counseling center, everything is confidential and free, which means that many students come in on their own. Their parents don't know that they're coming in. That's very different than the kind of therapy that you're going to probably set up for your students. So keeping that in mind, but we have several different kind of students coming in. So one student will come in and say about her year in Israel, it was an amazing experience. I met the best friends I've ever had. I'm roommates with them. I've decided on a major and I know what I'm going to become and I know what I want to study and I have chavrutas and I'm feeling great about it. Another young man comes into the office looking sad and exhausted. I can't keep up, he says. When we ask him more questions, it turns out that just like in his year in Israel, he's staying in the Beit Midrash until 2 a.m., making sure to be the last one there. And then, though, because he's now back in school, he's unable to focus and keep up with his schoolwork. He's devastated that he's not able to keep up the goals he set for himself in his year in Israel, and that he will learn as much as he did while he's there. And now he's feeling like a failure. And he recalls feeling like a failure many times when he couldn't keep up with the rigorous schedule that he had set for himself. Another one is a young woman that talks about the difficulties she had socially and feeling like everyone else fit in but her, until she finally made her own group of friends. How could all of these experiences be true? How could this experience be so wildly different for all different people? And the reality is that if you just change the gender in some of these 3 scenarios could have all happened to and do happen to all one person. So not only can the experience be so varied between people, but the experience itself is varied for the person himself or herself. There's a lot of ups and downs. There's moments that they're loving their social situation. There's moments that they're absolutely miserable in it. There's moments that they're in their groove with their learning, and there's moments that they're really not. So just keeping in mind all of that. What I decided to do today is Rabbi Stein sent me these incredible 5 questions that I think most parents have, that I think will be a great frame for us to answer some of the questions that you may all be having. So the first part, I'm going to share my screen with a PowerPoint, and then I'm going to switch back because it's hard for me, I feel like, not to be able to see people when I'm speaking for too long. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to start the PowerPoint, and then we'll go from there. So the first question that was asked to me is, what changes can I expect to see in my late teen as he or she enters adulthood? So, and as you see, I just want to comment, the reason I set this slide is because I think this is how we should view this year coming up. It's either a sunrise or a sunset. So right there, it's kind of unclear, right? But either way, a sunset or a sunrise is a transition. It's the end of something and the beginning of something else. And it moves quickly, and there's darkness and then there's light, or there's light and then there's darkness and then there's light. So I think we have to, and it's a beautiful thing. It's an image, it's something that we long to see, and it usually signifies a journey, which is what this year is all about. See if I'm able to move. Okay, so in 2000, I think even a little bit before that, Jeffrey Arnett, a psychologist, coined the term, a new term to describe this age group of young adults, which I'm sure you've all heard about, which is called emerging adulthood. He started noticing a lot of changes. It used to be that by the time a student was 19, 20, they were in college, they knew what they wanted to study, students were getting married, young people were getting married, starting their careers. And by the time they were in their mid-20s, they were on their way to in all of those things. People were married, had children, and were starting off in their careers. He noticed that this stage was really, really taking much longer now. It was taking people a lot longer to make decisions. Most kids were still living in their house by the time they were in their young 20s. Certainly people weren't settling into long-term relationships. They were not settling into their careers. And there was just a sort of elongated period of older adolescence. And so he realized that what was happening was not delayed adolescence, but a sort of developmental stage in and of itself called emerging adulthood. And this has 5 characteristics and 5 developmental goals. So just very quickly, the characteristics sort of are all similar to the transition idea. It's an age of exploration. This is 18 to 25 is what's defined as emerging adulthood. So age of exploration, it's an age of instability. Things are sort of like I said before, 1 minute's good, 1 minute may not be that good. Self-focused age. Now, I know you're all coming out of adolescence, and you're kind of like, how can they be more self-focused than that? But they continue to kind of be self-focused at this age. We work with them a lot, obviously, in our communities to help them, look outside of themselves. But by nature, this is a developmental stage where there's a lot of internal focus. And during that year in seminary and yeshiva, certainly. The age of feeling in between. So they feel they're supposed to be starting to feel like adults, but they're also very much feeling like children still. And it's the age of possibilities, thinking about that sunrise or sunset. So what emerges when you look at these characteristics is that these characteristics don't kind of lend themselves to starting college and, kind of knowing exactly where you want to go from here. And I think that's another thing that I want everybody to kind of keep in mind. We take for granted, this whole program is taking for granted that students go off to a year of gap learning. That's not the case, especially in the United States. It's not a common thing. And so it's very important to notice that the gap year, I'm going to get back to this, is situated in a very, very sort of brilliant way to help students do better when they get back to college, because all of these characteristics, although they do continue into emerging adulthood, are sort of very intense right now, and they're not really necessarily so set or well situated, like I said, for another year of very structured learning, which is what they would get in college, which is why throughout, we also use the CCAPs, actually. I wanted to say that, so maybe we should join Dr. Harris for some research afterwards. But in general, in the freshman population, not only through the CCAPs, but in the general freshman population, there are much, much higher rates of depression than what was found here. There's about 30% of students that at some point during their freshman year feel either some kinds of symptoms of depression or anxiety. The freshman year in college, at least in the United States, is characterized by tremendous drinking, tremendous poor decisions, and the retention rate for that year is dismal. It's about 58% of students don't necessarily stay in college. Sometimes they come back, sometimes they don't. The college experience is now considered completed if you do it within 6 years, not 4, because of the amount of loss that happens after the first year. So just keeping that in mind, and we're going to get back to it, students are not necessarily ready right away to go into a college experience. So what are the goals? What is it that they're trying to accomplish during these years? And I'm going to just try and kind of go through them a little bit quickly so we get to the more complicated things, but I do think it's important to keep in mind what is normative and what it is that they're trying to accomplish now. So the stages are separation and independence, achieving a sense of competency, managing emotions, emotional regulation, achieving intimacy, and achieving an identity. Okay, so separation, independence. So really the main goal of the older teen is to begin to separate from his or her parents. And the issue with it is that it doesn't look, it's not very direct. It's not very, okay, now you're separate. It's very, very back and forth. So I'll go back to this in a minute, but the other way. I always love this little cartoon. Yes, mother, I told you, I'm doing fine on my own in college. Hey, could you log on and find my schedule, order my books, and call me when it's time for class? So I think what this kind of shows is that, yes, they're going to tell you and they're going to fight for their independence, but they're not quite there yet. It's very much a back and forth. So what that looks like is leave me alone, but answer the WhatsApp the minute I call you, answer it right then. Be available the second I call you. They want to call the shots of that separation. Leave me alone, but please find me, give me money and make sure I have places for Shabbos. And when you see that, the reason I'm saying it is you have to understand. So when you don't know what's going on, always think, is this a separation thing? Is this them trying to be independent but having a hard time doing it? The goal of separation and independence obviously is to know their own opinions and their own inner voice and to gain confidence in making decisions. We're going to get back to that. To begin to function more independently, financially, personal hygiene, time management, finding solutions for problems on their own. We'll get to this a little bit more afterwards. And so what happens is a lot of research shows that at the end of the day, students will refer to their parents to determine their values. It's not that they're saying goodbye to them. They don't do that, but they want it to feel like it's coming from them. So they will explore a little bit and then they may come back to you and say, like, I thought this was so awesome. And you may say, like, we've been doing that, I've been telling you to sing Zemiros at the table for years. All of a sudden they go to somebody else's house and now they think that that's the most awesome thing because it's coming from them. It's not so much about the separation. All of these kinds of examples, they might come to you and say, I think I don't want to go to college. By the end of the year, they will most likely come back to your values if that's one of your values, but they may need to kind of experience that on their own so that they have more ownership of it. And I want to reiterate again, how much your parents, they do need you in terms of, so even if they're not asking you exactly your opinion, you should listen, but you're very welcome to say your opinion. Don't expect them to react positively necessarily, but don't feel that you can't also share your opinions and values when they're talking to you. And this is, I think, a little bit of why you see these volleys in hashkafot, where all of a sudden they might look to you like they're all the way to the right, all of a sudden they're all the way. And some of that might stick. It's not that it doesn't. Some of it might. Hopefully the parts that you feel good about will, but it's because they're trying to create opinions on their own. Okay, this is a very important one. Achieving a sense of competency is very important for them. Knowing what they're good at is one of the big questions of this age. What am I good at? What do I want to do? And this is the first time that they're not, in high schools, there's already a lot of preset sort of rankings and everybody sort of knows who's good at school, who's not so good at school. So this is their new way to start over with what they're good at. And they might surprise themselves because it's a whole new way of learning. They might really feel like they can learn a lot better now, whether it's because the assessments are different or because there are no assessments or because they get to choose what they want to learn. I know yeshivot aren't quite that way, but some are. Or because some of them have more chesed opportunities and learning opportunities, or because they're, again, they made this choice, they decided that they want to do it. So, and some of them may say, I thought I wasn't good at Gemara, I think I am. And some may say, it may be hard for some of them who always thought that they were a top student. And now a little bit they're struggling and they're seeing some other students kind of having an easier time. So we don't have answers for all these things, but these are the kinds of things that they're kind of looking at. What are they good at? And the goal is to walk away knowing that they're good at something, sometimes something that they didn't know that they were good at. Especially, I think this is why some of those programs that have chesed opportunities are so nice, because they may have an opportunity to see that they're good, with children with special needs or with victims of terror or things that they didn't necessarily have a chance to do while in the States. Okay, the third goal, I think this is it's a very big category, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, but it's really one of the most important. Managing emotions and emotional regulation, and Dr. Harris talked about this a little bit, is so fundamental. The kind of therapy he does, DBT, has an entire sort of focus on this. But managing emotions and emotional regulation is a little bit, I'm broadening it. Usually emotional regulation means knowing how to handle difficult emotions, knowing how to handle when you're feeling, mood fluctuations, when you're very upset, even when you're very happy, but mostly when you're very worried, when you're very scared, when you're very upset. What I like to say is, when you go away to camp or you go to a sleepover and you're in a bad mood, you can kind of, even in camp, if something's upsetting you, can kind of push things down for a certain amount of time. But in a year, you really, really can't. And especially with all the changes that are happening. So, they're going to have, difficult emotions. If they the typed out outbursts before, that's going to happen again. Anxieties, all of those kinds of things. How to manage that on their own without the anchor of coming home and you helping them manage that. That's one of the very, very big goals of emotional regulation. That's something they need to learn throughout this time in college, in the gap year, in emerging adulthood. I'm putting into that same category sort of managing your behaviors, knowing how your emotions and your behaviors and your self-care is how I would put it, go together. So things like learning how to take care of your own physical needs, which are related to your emotions, and those include sleep. It's very, very important to mention sleep. I don't think we focus on that enough. Many of the kinds of emotional, within the range of normal emotional up and downs that students go through is because they're not sleeping enough. And there's not so much we can do about that, except for to keep reminding them, to give them opportunities to do it and to know it for ourselves. Sleep is extremely important. There's an interesting study done during COVID about adolescents. And so just on a side note, it was found that young adults were the ones who've actually suffered the most during COVID, not adolescents, but young adults and single parents. And one of the reasons that adolescents didn't suffer so much is because A, they were home more, but B, they were allowed to sleep more. Their schedules changed so that they were able to wake up later for Zooms, and they really showed a difference because of that. So we have to keep things like that in mind, but they're going to have to learn that on their own. They're going to have to notice that, when they stay up all night, they're really not doing so well the next day. You're not there to necessarily remind them that. Eating. So, the same way that Dr. Harris talked about that. Eating, at home, this might be the reason that he saw such an increase in that issue, is because at home, as much as you may not realize that there's a lot of regulation that's happening, knowing what they're eating all the time. Now that regulation is being taken away. And so they might sort of, what I like to say is accidentally develop an eating disorder. It isn't that they have an eating, sometimes they do, absolutely. And sometimes it sort of becomes, they're trying this new diet and they're liking how they look and they're not able to balance that properly. Or their friends are all saying that they should be on diets, or the other way, they're eating a lot of things that aren't healthy for them. So, this is all within still what's normal, but this is one of the challenges. Habits, behaviors, coping mechanisms. I think Dr. Harris alluded to this also. Things like, the internet, eating, these are coping mechanisms that they use without even realizing it. Let's say they had, a hard day. They will sort of try to self-regulate using their phone or eating something that they like, or isolating in the room, or whatever that is. This is their time to learn how to use those coping mechanisms in better ways. They're starting to learn how to make decisions and have consequences, and they're learning about finance. Okay, social intimacy, navigating social relationships. Some of the challenges that happen here are, imagine you're sending your child off, and two different things can happen. One is that they want to make new friends, and their friends also want to make new friends. And so they can often feel like very abandoned by seeing other, their friends trying to make new friends, even though they know that they might want to do the same thing. They might feel abandoned or left behind. They may also not want that at all. And they might want to just totally stick with their old friends, and that might also not work out for them. It takes a while, like the vignette that I said at the beginning, to find your place. So, you can listen out for that. All of that is within the realm of normal. in terms of other issues that can happen socially, there's the peer pressure. So we mentioned a lot of times already, the peer pressure of growing, the peer pressure of learning. Am I learning as much as my friend? Am I growing as much as my friend? And they could put tremendous amount of pressure on themselves that's not suited for them to do that. And obviously, there's peer pressure the other way as well for making bad choices, drinking, substances, and obviously they have much more freedom now, and so that does happen, even though it might happen with less frequency than in the regular freshman year of college. It can happen. And the new skills that they're learning to do during this time are managing conflict, being assertive, learning how to manage conflicts with even with professors and other people like that, or their teachers, and stepping out of their comfort zones. And when I say being assertive, that's a really important one, being able to say what it is that they want, whether out of their roommates or their teachers in school. Okay. And lastly, achieving identity. That's a really big one. That's actually not something that, happens in 1 year at all, but it is what they're trying to do during this journey. And this is the questions they're asking all the time. Who am I? How do I fit in? How can I make a difference? And, just what I want to say before I go on to the next one is that these obviously all overlap with each other. The social things can affect their ways of coping. It can affect their physical behaviors, their sleeping and eating, can affect their ability to be competent in their learning. So, it's not so linear where they're doing this and this and this exact developmental goal. They kind of can all intersect to make things feel a little bit intense. I'm actually not going to spend too much time on this, but I did just want to say in this slide and the next slide that the gap year, because I did mention this before, is really this brilliant way. Now that you hear more about what it is that they're trying to accomplish during this year, you can see that having this group of students coming into a college with all of these goals, right away, can really create a place where they might not succeed. So, the gap year inherently allows for more exploration, flexing of different muscles, but at the same time, you have that safety net. And that's so important for you to know. Your children have a safety net. Besides the fact that somebody's doing their laundry, right? Somebody's really watching out for them. And if there's one thing I want to say, I'm going to say it wherever it fits in. It's so important to trust the school. They know for good referrals. They've seen so many students coming in and out. They know when something isn't quite right or when it is. They've structured these programs and the ones that your kids have picked just in the right way to kind of allow for some exploration, but also some safety. And students who have done gap years all come back and say that they benefited so much from building resilience, defining their passion, becoming self-directed, learning how to understand the role in the community. I mean, these are not Jewish programs per se. These are just, gap year programs. I think most of them in Europe, actually, because like I said, we don't have too many in the United States. It's growing now, but not so much. So, I'm going to I think what I'm going to do now is kind of show you what the next questions are, and then I'm going to get off the PowerPoint so I can maybe see some people. But the next questions were, I'm paying all this money for what's supposed to be an amazing year. Why is my child struggling? The next one is, what is developmentally normal and what is a red flag that help is needed? I'm going to get back to it. Question 4 is, how do I know when to intervene and when to just listen? What is my role as a parent? And question 5 is, how do I talk to my child about getting help? So I do have other slides, but I think I'm going to, maybe I'll just do a little bit more on the PowerPoint. Can somebody give me feedback? Is the PowerPoint okay, or should I get off the PowerPoint? If Rabbi Stein is on there.
It's great, very effective.
Okay, so you know what, I'll keep it going until I didn't take notes on it. Some of them don't have notes on it. Okay. So question number 2, I loved. Why is my child struggling if I paid so much money for this and this is supposed to be an amazing year, right? Okay, so the answer to that is that all of the above that I just mentioned is super stressful when you think about it, right? It really is. And I hate to say this, but in a way we should look at it this way. The struggle is exactly what you're paying for. The struggle is the point. The idea, the exploration, that is part of the idea of it. So we ourselves should remove the expectation that every minute is going to be great and they're going to call us in good moods all the time. The other thing to remember is, and you all know this as parents, they call you when it's not good. Most of the time, you have to know your child. So not all the time that they call you and they complain, it means that they're not doing well. It means that they're not doing well in that moment. And we have to have the reserves as parents to call somebody else and kind of handle that, not necessarily panic. But the struggle is extremely, extremely normal. And, they're dealing with a lot during this time. So that's, one of the reasons that they are struggling. However, what is developmentally normal and what is not? So there are times that the struggle is more serious and something we have to look at. So very quickly, we already said this, for freshmen and for gap year students, these are the challenges that they have to deal with: new freedoms and responsibilities, new learning requirements, challenges to beliefs and values, changing relationships, and so on. But there are sort of a list of things that we normally see at the counseling center that I'm sure are similar things that people are seeing in the year in Israel. Homesickness, adjustment to a new country, issues with sleep, eating, exercise, being unable to be organized. One other thing that I do want to mention as part of something normal and why they struggle is expectations. I asked all of the counselors that work with us, what do you see the most as something that students complain about when they get back? And almost all of them said their expectations. They had such high expectations for this year. And also in Migdal Oz, there's one of the teachers there is Shana Lerner. She's wonderful. She just put out a new book. And she always used to say to the students, don't take your temperature every second. Like, don't
Dr. Muscat, sorry to interrupt, but students going to Migdal Oz will know her as Shana Goldberg, her married.
Oh, did I say Lerner? I've known her since she was, that's funny, thank you. Shana Goldberg, correct. I didn't even tell her I was going to quote her. Thank you for saying that. But yeah, she always says this, don't take your temperature every second. So you could say that to your kids. They shouldn't be measuring how they feel every minute, and they shouldn't be comparing, we should manage expectations before they go, if we can. Okay, when should I wanted to make sure I'm rushing because I want to make sure I get to this. When should you start to be a little bit more concerned is when you see something that you, trust yourself. If you don't feel good about it, then you're probably onto something. B, if the school tells you, again, trust the school. If the school calls you and they're concerned, you must take that seriously. See if they tell you, if the student themselves tells you. That's, the most interesting is they get students that tell me, I told my parents for years I want therapy. And I might fall into this category too, who knows? And you kind of delay, and until you do it, it can happen. But if they come to you and say that they need help, go ahead and find them the help that they need. Now, in terms of things that you may see that they may not see, social withdrawal, excessive self-criticism, all the things that the students at the beginning spoke about so bravely, marked change in their appearance and behavior, very negative self-talk is really, really important. Calling crying a lot more than not calling crying, not that normal amount. Obviously, talking about self-harm, hopelessness, like it's never going to get better. What's the point? Those are things you don't want to be hearing too much of. What's the point? If you hear that more than once, that's already a little bit more than what you want to be hearing. Excessive fatigue or lethargic mood, or the other way, too much energy. They're never sleeping. God forbid they're not making sense. That's a big concern. If they ever call you with certain things that you should know are emergencies. So self-harm, thoughts of hurting themselves or killing themselves, not making sense, or things that sound like they're not thinking, they're not oriented, I think is really important to think about. Okay, so those are the things that are of concern. I do want to say, I'll go to the next section and then I'll kind of go back to it. I'll go through it a little. I'm running a little bit out of time, but I think I'll get to everything. What I will say is, in that, once you start to see areas of concern, like the ones we mentioned, so in the counseling center, we kind of call that tier 2. So tier 1 are all the normal developmental things that we talked about. Tier 2 is when you're worried. Tier 3 is the emergency things that I talked about. But tier 2, which is when things are more serious and they should be getting some help, that's when you would want to start thinking about therapy. Now, certainly, I think the lesson to be learned from that video is if your children have had therapy before, set them up with therapy after, when they get there, even if they're not going to need to use it. just so that you have, let's say, 2 names of people you want to go to. And then when they start to feel like this, you can much more easily kind of hook them into it. So that's really important. And obviously for medication purposes as well, anybody that's on medication should have somebody local in Israel as well, if possible. But I think they're going to address that much more in the next one. So when you're seeing those things, what's the goal? The goal is to get them help on the ground in Israel. But how do I know when to intervene and when to just listen? What's my role as a parent? So this is what I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about, kind of what you can do when you're starting to see concerns. Okay, so the point of this slide is just to say this is a learning stage. This is there's some developmental goals for you as well, and you need to kind of be aware. Am I panicking because something that has to do with me, or does it have to do with them? Am I having a hard time separating? For me, one of an example of something was one of my sons when he went to Israel for the year, or my only son that went to Israel for the year, he had some stuff here. He never minds me talking about it. He's a wonderful, wonderful young man. Very proud of him. And we sent him off to Israel, and we reached a little bit. He chose a yeshiva that obviously we wanted him to succeed at, but I wasn't positive. And he called me within 2 nights and he was like, this is really hard. This is the hardest thing I've ever done. And literally I said to my husband, Jonathan, we're getting him out. Like, he doesn't need to do that yeshiva. He could do a different yeshiva. It's fine. And my husband said to me, can you give him like 3 days? Can you give him 2 weeks? I wasn't able to do that, including everything else that we needed to do. I'm not saying that's the only thing to do is time, but I had to be aware of my own reaction. Hearing him struggle was not something I was able to tolerate. So keep that in mind for yourself. So when it's tier 1, stay in touch I think I would say as an overall, stay in touch with your children, be available for them. Like I said, as a joke before, but it's really true. Be available for them on their time. If you can, you're allowed to set limits. If they're calling you 3 times a day, no. But if they call you, what you decided with them in advance was good, whether it's every 2 days, whatever you decide, and they're doing that, be available for them. If they're stretching it a little bit more, be available a little bit more than that. Try to really listen, and give them space if you can. Don't panic. Don't over assume responsibility. Again, now I'm just talking about when it's in the realm of normal things. You should have a couple of tools at your disposal that that work for you and that you can share with them if you think they're interested. And I'll get back to that in a minute. What you want to do is this mixture of listening and validating. So you start with listening and you start with validating. But there is a concept of like over validating or co-ruminating. I started reading about that, where you're just kind of like in it with them too much, where you might want to say, look, can I give you some tips? Use that language. Is it possible for me to give you some tips that might work? Or don't do it in a conversation, but text it to them. And try some of these things. I know they seem very basic, but the basic stuff does work. Better breathing skills. Exercise is so important. Having them go for a walk if they can every day, or vigorous exercise 2 to 3 times a week. All the yeshivas and seminaries are set up for that. Nature, just seeing trees is really, really important. Some of the schools have that, some don't as much. So even just like looking at trees in the window can really help. Journaling, positive self-talk, reminding them to be more positive with themselves, and sleep. So try to normalize things as much as you can. However, when it's already something, and I know I'm kind of running out of time. I think this is becoming the more important part, so I'm just going to go through it. When you're a little bit more concerned. Oh, and then in addition, though, always when they're coming to you with something, always say to them, is there something you could do about it? Can you call the school? Can you, make sure, try and hand it off to them. At the same time, I want to just say one other thing, which is there's nothing wrong with a little bit helping them behind the scenes if you feel that that's what they need. I just read about a very nice concept called invisible support in a great new book called Chatter, which is all about anxiety, basically, in a different name. And it talked about how as parents or even as friends, sometimes they're not asking you for help, but you know that they need the help. You could do what's called invisible support, which is helping them in ways that they don't necessarily see. So there's nothing necessarily wrong. So let's say as a roommate, you would, make the surroundings very neat, or you would, have a date that you'd set up to go out to eat with them, something just to support them in a way that's not so direct. But it's okay to call the school when you're worried. You can't do it every day, and you can't do it about small things. But if you're feeling that it's going from tier 2 to tier 1 to tier 2, or you're just worried, it's okay to call or email the school. They will let you know. You can even ask them to the school. You could say, am I doing too much of this? But invisible support means if they're having a rough week, your child, it's okay to help them find a place for Shabbos that week, to make the phone call to your friend to help them. You don't have to feel like they have to do it all on their own. You could use your judgment to kind of do some and some, because they do need support along the way. If you are concerned, when to intervene is all the things that I said, and to directly say to them, look, these are the things I'm seeing. You're more sad than usual. You're more anxious than usual. I'm not liking what I'm seeing about this. So many people go to therapy. 25% of students are going to therapy. It's the same number we have. We have 25% of college students going to therapy. It's a huge, huge number. It's much larger than the general population. It means that it's a very normalized thing to do. I think that's a huge accomplishment for the yeshivas that they're getting that many students going to therapy. So, normalize the therapy process. You be okay with the therapy process. Figure out a way to be okay with the money of the process. Don't put it on them that it's too much money. I know it's expensive. It's worth every penny if it's helpful. So be kind of okay with that. I want to just mention that it's very important before they go to Israel. Speak to them about their expectations, but also I think it's really important to talk to them about some of the things that may not be as within the realm of everything that we talked about. Now that they're going off to Israel and they're actually having a little time to think, certain things might come up to the surface that they don't always have time for. So whether that's sexual identity, whether that's noticing that a habit that they've had, I mentioned internet, but, to be even more direct about it, watching too much pornography, gambling online, these are things that, oh, okay, I have 2 more minutes, 1 more, and I'm going to finish up. But, I know it's an important topic, but, these are things that you always think, okay, I'll talk to them about it later, but there's no real later. And while they're under your own roof, you could talk about it later because you feel safe because they're near you. But now they're going off and they're not going to be here. And it's important for them to hear from you that these are times that these issues might come up. It might come up that they either have had questions about their sexual identity always, or they do now, or that their friend might. And that's why I think it's really important to, talk about that, to be very, very kind and accepting of themselves and of others. And whatever your opinions are about these things, the most important thing is to say to them before they go, I will love you and accept you no matter what, but I don't want you to do things on your own. There are rebbeim in school that can help you. There are many, many wonderful psychologists that can help you. I know you don't want to say to them, you don't even have to tell me, because I think that's hard. In college, it's okay if they go to a therapist without the parent. It's a more touchy subject, a little more complicated in the year in Israel. I think I would leave that to the experts in Israel to talk about, but to explain to them that these are not atypical things that happen, and that they shouldn't have shame. If they find that they're using the internet too much, or they're not alone in these things. These are things that happen to everybody. These are things at different scales, and these are things that this is their time to deal with that. And, not to let themselves kind of go into a rut of hopelessness about any of these topics. So I know I kind of sped through some of these things. I don't know if there's any more time for questions or not, but I think I'm going to stop the share now. And if there's time for questions, if not, you can send them to me and I can try to email answers afterwards.
Okay, I did get one question in the chat box, which I'll direct to you. We have kind of a 5-minute flex time in the middle here. Tanya will be starting at 1:35 with her presentation. Okay. So the question was asked, it was asked before you said some of the things that you said. So I'll kind of refine it a little bit to still be relevant after some of the additional information that you gave. Is let's say your child is getting all the support that they need from you in terms of the overall handling of the situation. You've either given them the techniques, directed them to the staff at their program, set them up with a therapist. The large issues of support are there. You're making time for them to call you and speak to you, and you're getting the sense that, as difficult as it is for you, that the crying and that experience on the phone with you is not helpful for them, or you're not sure how much of it to give and how much of it to withdraw in order to allow them to work on coping on their own. How do you know where to draw that line, and how do you manage that conversation with them of saying to them, I think it's better for you to go now than for us to stay on the line?
Yeah. And I think it's a great question. It's the question. And I think I think I would say to that, very similar to what Dr. Harris said at first, that didn't start here, right? If it's similar to what always went on at home, do the same thing you would do at home. If it's something new, I would give it a little bit more time, is I think what I'm trying to say. If they're usually pretty independent kids and all of a sudden they're calling you all the time like this, there might be something going on that they're having a hard time verbalizing. So I would extend the patience a little bit. If they kind of always do this, and now they're just doing it more, I think I would experiment with them to say, look, to really verbalize with them, this is your time to kind of cope with this. Here are some really good ideas. And then, give them any of the ideas that I mentioned very quickly. I really do recommend this book, Chatter, and has some very nice ideas, but really recommend your ideas. Send it to them by text if you want. And if you're okay with this, I think it might be okay to even call someone in the school and say, look, I'm probably gonna set a little bit of a limit, or I'm probably not gonna respond right away, or I decided with her that I'm setting a limit, and then do that. I wouldn't pull it as like a one-time surprise, but I think I would start to gradually let them know I need to do this, and then you could do this invisible support of making sure that the support net is still there. So I don't know if I answered that, but something along those lines.
Right. If you don't mind, I'll just add, and you can tell me if this is off base, something that the mental health professional at one of the programs that one of my older children went to said to us was that getting the feedback from the program as to whether, the crying and is what they're experiencing also, seeing in the dorm, seeing in programs, or whether it's reserved for the kids' conversation with you, is very important information to have also. There's a big difference. It doesn't mean it's not problematic if it's only happening with you, but it's important information to have. Are they walking around happy, functional, and involved everywhere else except for on the phone with you? Or is it spilling out to other things as well?
Perfect. Exactly. So keep that communication going with the schools. Exactly.
Okay, excellent. All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Muscat. This was really tremendously helpful information for all of us. Again, I as well, a parent who's now sending my fourth child off to gap year this year, as well as I know there are many Israel guidance counselors, members of staff of programs in Israel who are here with us as well. And definitely one of our big goals is to keep all of these groups of people working together to help our children during this year in conversation with one another. Okay, so I'll ask Dr. Muscat if you can put the name of the book that you're mentioning in the chat for everyone to see. Somebody's asking for that. And we will be sending out a summary of information and a recording of much of the event to everybody who participated and who registered. So you will get the slides as well through that recording. Okay, I'm now going to turn over the floor to Tanya Prochko. Tanya is a therapist who made Aliyah in 2012 and opened up a private practice in Israel. And in her private practice saw a wide gap between the mental health needs of the English-speaking public and their ability to access help in English in Israel. And because of that, founded Get Help Israel, which is an organization that has helped thousands of English speakers to find the right help and to improve their quality of life. Much of their work is directed towards the English-speaking population who lives in Israel, but they also do a tremendous amount of work with the gap year English-speaking population from all over the English-speaking world that converge in Israel to study, learn, grow, and develop. So she is going to really be able to walk us through some of the practical things of being able to find, access the correct type of mental health care while in Israel, as well as many of the common difficulties and hurdles that one might experience from a different country trying to access that care in a different country with a different healthcare system. So really thankful to her and to Get Help Israel as an organization for partnering with us in this program today. So Tanya, I turn over the floor to you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Rabbi Stein. This is a fantastic program, really, really incredible. And I'll do my best to walk you all through and make sure that you're able to access the right help for your children and get their mental health needs met. So as Rabbi Stein was starting to say that when I made Aliyah, there was this gap here in Israel. And as I was speaking to more therapists, I was starting to learn that everyone is seeing this. Clients are coming to us saying, I had this horrible experience with this therapist, with that therapist. I didn't know how to find a therapist. And so this is one of the things that I started to learn that, and this is important for me to give over to you all, what is different here in Israel than what you're used to in the US. It's a little bit of a Wild West in the sense that the word therapist and psychotherapist is not regulated here in Israel. So anybody can really call themselves a therapist or psychotherapist, hang a shingle on their door, and start seeing patients, clients, and there is no law against that. So one of the things that Get Help Israel as an organization tried to do in forming the organization is create some level of standard for what we expect our therapists to have in terms of their education, in terms of their training. So we based it on what the US model is, which is a postgraduate degree in mental health. In accordance with Israeli law, which, in Israel, only psychologists, social workers, and psychiatrists in the mental health field have a licensing body, which leaves us with two problems. The first problem is what I had just mentioned, that anybody can be a therapist and it's not an issue. And Anglos come to therapy and they assume that if this is a therapist, then they must be licensed, because that's really how it works in their countries of origin. So there was this issue. And then the second issue is that many English-speaking qualified professionals who do not fall under the category of social worker, psychologist, or psychiatrist fell into this gray area where they couldn't get licensed. They still can't get licensed here, but they're licensed in the US and they hold master's level or PhD or PsyD level trainings in counseling, psychology, or marriage and family therapy, which are legitimate degrees, but here they cannot be licensed. So it's important for you all, when you are searching for a therapist for your child, to just understand the distinction between someone who is lucky enough to come here and fall into one of these umbrellas, or still be qualified in the US, but not really have a license in Israel, and who you shouldn't come near because they're not really qualified at all. So one of the things about the organization of Get Help Israel is, that if you come to our website, everyone on our site has been verified in the therapist section. And I want to make that distinction, that there is a distinction between the therapist section and the life coaches section. Life coaches requirements are that they just have a certification in life coaching. But in the therapist section, their minimum requirement is that they hold a master's level or higher in the mental health field from an accredited program. So that's really, really important to note. And I will walk you through the website so that you know how to use it, so that you can access all the different services that are available in English. So that's an important distinction that I wanted to start with. And I didn't want to do a whole, a PowerPoint. I wanted to talk to you. I wanted to make this kind of a conversation, and you will get I'll share my screen and you'll get a walkthrough, like I said. So let's start with that. Let's go to the site and show you what it's like. I'm going to put the URL in comments afterwards as well. It's gethelpisrael.com. You all can see the screen here?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So you come to the home page, and this is just a general search. There is a more detailed filter once you actually start your search. But here you can start with therapist, psychiatrist, life coach, or treatment facility. So let's start with psychiatrist. Specializing in, there's a whole number of specialties. We'll choose anxiety. Region, you can also select. Let's leave region blank for now, because the psychiatrist list is actually not that long. But these are English-speaking psychiatrists throughout Israel, mostly in Jerusalem. Here's Dr. Harris, that you're all familiar with from today. And you can click on any profile and get the details of that therapist. So we can just look at it, at that psychiatrist. All of their important information is here in their profile. Their contact information, their email, and their qualifications, where they're licensed, whether they're licensed abroad as well as Israel, their specialties, etc. So this is basically all you're going to need to know in order to get that information. Now, if we go to the therapist section, it's the same idea, doing a similar search. By the way, when you're doing a filter here, you'll see all the different categories that are filtered. If you wanted to do, let's say, Jerusalem, no, I don't know why that's showing. If you're getting something funky with the filter, you can always reset the search results and try again, because we actually just added a new category today, which is this primary specialties, and I think it needs to be tweaked a little bit more. So I apologize if there's a little bit of a bump in this search process. It was something that was added just today. So we're going to look at, let's say Jerusalem, and you get just the psychiatrist in the Jerusalem area. So it's very user-friendly, easy to use. We'll go to the therapist section and give you this similar kind of walkthrough. Here you'll see a lot more results. So the filter becomes much more useful here. And you have all different categories. Therapeutic approach, that's if you know exactly the type of approach that you want to get for your child, you use these filters. Otherwise, you can really just go based on specialty, based on region. Sometimes the gender of the therapist is important, so you can just filter based on that, and select a handful of therapists that you want to speak to, give them a call, have a phone consultation. This is really, really important point. Don't worry about speaking to as many therapists as you need to in order to find the right match for your child. Everyone is available for a phone consultation, 10, 15 minutes. It's absolutely fine to do that. One of the things that we're actually working on, it was supposed to be ready for today for this conference, is we're going to have a section here called a quick search. And under that is going to be therapists who are experienced in working with the gap year population. So I would say check back with the site within this coming week, and you'll see this section here. And they'll have a little badge on their profile. I'm trying to think of a therapist who has a different badge that we can look up. Let's see. All right, so Timmy Garay here, she has a badge where she's a participant of the Lone Soldier program. The gap year therapists will have their own badge here stating that they are a qualified therapist with experience in working with this particular population. And underneath it will be a little kind of paragraph with them explaining exactly what type of issues they have experience in working with. So as, Dr. Harris, Dr. Muscat have spoken about the different issues that are prevalent in this population, those are the type of things you're going to see. So come back to the site. It was supposed to be ready for today, but they didn't make it in time. But this was something that we developed, customized for you all and for the actual yeshivas and seminaries to be able to access a niche type of therapist to work with the gap year students. Okay, so that's kind of the general searches for therapists. The other point I wanted to make, and I think that it was touched upon in the previous talks, is if your child is already seeing a therapist in the US, Israel does not have regulations for a US-based therapist seeing clients in Israel. Okay, so if they have great rapport, they've been working together for a while, teletherapy is not an issue, then that's probably your best bet to just continue with that therapist. If you feel like, they need to see someone face-to-face, or, they want to see someone in Israel, then this is a great option. There is an advantage also to doing this together with your child, they can play a role in selecting a therapist that resonates with them, that they feel like they connect with. A lot of these programs, a lot of the seminaries and yeshivas have their own therapist that they do send to, that they have a relationship with, and that's wonderful. But if there's a situation where you really need like a niched professional, someone who specializes in eating disorders specifically, or someone who specializes in addictions or gender identity issues, etc., you can really kind of hone in on a specialist. This is why we actually added this section today, and you can even see it in Timmy's profile. The primary specialties are just blank at the moment, because it used to be just specialties, and there was just a long list of specialties. And we today separated and made a distinction between primary specialties and additional specialties, because, for example, my primary specialty is trauma. I'm a trauma therapist. But under my specialties, I had a list of all these other things that I work with. And it's important for us to make the distinction that this is my primary specialty, but I also work with anxiety and depression and everything else. So you will see with time, right now the therapists are coming and updating their profiles. You will see within the next week or so, and you can really do that more of a specific search. So for example, right now I'm just going to do it under additional specialties, because like I said, primary specialties are not so filled out. But, let's say we look at ADHD and we've got 40 results, and we want to now, limit it to Yerushalayim. So now we've got 20 therapists to choose from. And if you really wanted to kind of make it more gender specific, let's say you wanted male therapists only. So you have 7 therapists in Yerushalayim that specialize in ADHD. But again, hopefully you'll be able to do that with the primary specialty versus the secondary specialty. So you know that it's someone who really, this is their niche. That's important. In terms of insurance, I know that was one of the things that that does come up. Who's going to pay for therapy? Can I get my insurance company to pay for the therapy that my child receives in Israel? It's a complicated question. I would say the best way to get that answered, because every insurance company is different, you want to check with your insurance company and see what their out-of-network coverage looks like. How much of that deductible you've already used up versus what your deductible is going to be anyway, and you're going to be paying out of pocket for that anyway. And then if they do cover it, if it is not an issue with your insurance company, then you're going to need a therapist who is also licensed in the state in which you are at, where that's connected with your insurance. So that's not so pashut. It's not so simple. You will likely end up paying out of pocket for this therapy. However, there are some there's some exceptions to this. Number one, many therapists offer a special rate for students. So I'll show you what that looks like in the filter. It would be under discounts and promotions, and you have student discount. Okay, so you'll have therapists who specified that they offer a student discount, and then that's a conversation. You can be in touch with them and let them know that it's for a gap year student and what is their discount. The other option would be, I'm going to give you a little tour over here. So other than find a therapist, psychiatrist, life coach, and we'll come back to treatment facility because we'll talk about that shortly. Support groups, that's an option. If one of the things that we recently set up are virtual support groups at GHI. These are all online groups. They're much more affordable than individual therapy. But again, sometimes one is warranted or both are warranted. So that's something for you to determine. And so that's just our small list of support groups. And then there is other support groups. Many of them are run by nonprofit organizations. There's anonymous meetings. These are all in English. So many of them are free. That's my point, is that you can access these without cost. There is also something we have called subsidized services. Now, these are organizations that offer mental health services at a subsidized cost. So they're very, very low cost therapy. So you can see here all the different types of services that are offered for different types of issues, and scroll through here and see if this is an option. If private therapy is not affordable, then there are other ways to get help for your child. Okay, so that's the subsidized services. Let's take a look at treatment facilities for a moment. The facilities that we have listed here are ones that are outpatient facilities, although AZ House is an inpatient facility, but these are great facilities to really just explore for various different needs. We have Beit Daniela, which is amazing. They are in Tzor Hadassah, in rural, a lot of outdoor activities with animals, and it's really great for emotional regulation, eating disorders. Like, they have certain specialties, and excellent staff, and a great program. It's worth exploring. Machon Dvir, as you heard Dr. Harris talk about as well. These are all niched facilities that is worth exploring. If this is the needs of your child, these are great facilities to know about. We have Koli for eating disorders here. So that's the facilities. Now, God forbid, should there be a need for an inpatient, psychiatric facility, as a parent overseas, it can be really kind of scary. What's going on in Israel, and what is there for my child? So here you have a list of all the different psychiatric facilities. If it were to come to that, okay, so you should just know what's here and what they're about, and to explore that with your child's psychiatrist. Obviously, this would only be done with the care of a psychiatrist, but just so you know that the information is here on the site for you. Okay, I believe that's everything in terms of searching the site. Anybody have any questions about navigating the site?
I didn't get any questions about navigating the site per se, but I did get a couple of other questions. If anyone does have questions specifically about navigating the site, please put them in the chat as well, and I'll direct them to Tanya. So somebody did ask about the insurance, and I believe that you did address that. I'll just say to the person, if there's more specific questions related to that Tanya didn't cover, please put them back in the chat. And then somebody did ask about medication and how to continue getting medication in Israel if the child is continuing with their US doctor. So did we want Dr. Harris to address that, or did you want to?
No. I'm happy to hand that over to Dr. Harris. That's definitely more his area of expertise. And then I'll proceed. Do you want me to proceed first, and then we'll leave that till I'm done? How do you want to do that? Do you want to address that question first?
Oh, okay. Either way, you tell me.
Okay, so let's answer it because it came up and we're paused. So
okay.
Can you hear me, Tanya?
Yes.
Yeah.
Fantastic. First of all, I just want to give a real shout out for Get Help Israel, because Tanya's done an amazing job in organizing a tremendous amount of information, and it really was a Wild West. And in certain ways, as she said, it still is somewhat of a Wild West. So really having people who are verified and qualified and licensed is tremendously important. And the stuff that Tanya, you were showing me here that I wasn't even aware of in terms of all the English listings of the various hospitals, which I think is exceptionally important. So it's definitely worthwhile having a look through many of the links here that you can see on the screen. It's a great resource, both as a clinician, and certainly I know for my clients, often there'll be many people that I'm unable to see, or even within the service that I'm running, it's not relevant or appropriate. And I'll say, look, go to Get Help Israel, because that's really the best place to find what it is that you need. So it's really fantastic service. In terms of medications, there's certain advantages to the fact that Israel can be a little bit of a balagan in certain ways. There's a lot less regulation. That also goes in terms of medication as well. It's pretty easy and straightforward to get most medications here. If we start with a gap year student who is coming across with medication, in general, I've never encountered any issues, and maybe Tanya, I don't know whether you know, but if students coming across, generally there's no issues bringing in their medications, especially if they show that, you know, they've got some sort of a prescription from a doctor. I've never heard of anyone being stopped or having their medication confiscated. So certainly for, you know, a period of 3 months is not an issue. Sometimes what happens is family members will bring over extra medication. I will flag that it's important that they're still doing follow-up in the same way that they would continue to do follow-up with therapy with their clinician over in the US or wherever it is. They still need to be checking in with their psychiatrist back in the US and not just sort of getting open-ended prescriptions. It's generally, most medications you can get here, most medications are even cheaper than what they cost in the US. The US is very expensive for some reason for a lot of just generic medications. In Israel, you can go and get something like an SSRI, such as escitalopram, which is called Lexapro in the US. It's called Cipralex in Israel. It's the same medication, and it will cost something like $10 or $15 a month. So that's not even something that necessarily you need to spend hours trying to get money back from an insurance company over. It's not a huge expense to get the medications here. There are certain medications that do cost more. ADD medications, for instance, especially the longer acting ones, such as Vyvanse and Concerta, can be expensive. And then it depends on the insurance that you have either in Israel. Sometimes, and rarely, insurance back in the US will cover certain medication expenses. Sometimes seeing a psychiatrist, less likely a therapist. It's a little bit trickier to get money back through insurance overseas for that. There are certain medications that are difficult to get. For whatever reason, they're not on the medical basket in Israel. You can still get them, and you can get a special dispensation to get these medications. So for instance, for whatever reason, Adderall XR is not easily available in Israel. Focalin is not necessarily easily available, or Focalin XR. Some of these medications, for whatever reason, they're just not easily available, but you can get them if you need them. The other thing as well is to think about, there are certain advantages in having people locally as well. So whether that's in therapy, whether that's in psychiatry, there's a lot of psychiatrists, for instance, that I have a good working relationship with over in the US, and there's a lot of referrals back and forth just to make sure that there's continuity of care in terms of getting medications. They'll tell me what medications they're on, and they'll even check in with me. Can they get these medications here, or do I need to send them with medications over? So that can often be very, very helpful, just knowing what's here, what's not here. The bottom line is Israel has a very developed medical system. You can get most medications here. They're reasonably priced. The big question is to work out in terms of follow-up, is it sufficient that they'll just have the psychiatric follow-up with the psychiatrist who they're used to, or does it help to have someone who's local? And that will be determined by a case-by-case basis.
Dr. Harris, I got a flurry of follow-ups here, which I was also wondering about myself. If somebody has a script from their, let's say, US or Canadian doctor or wherever it might be, and they bring it to an Israeli pharmacy, can that be filled in an Israeli pharmacy, or do they need an Israeli doctor to?
The simple answer is that doesn't work in any country in the world. Unless you're licensed in that country, you cannot write an overseas prescription. So I can't write for the US, or England. It needs to actually be written by a local doctor. Now, what I will say is that not always does someone need to come and see me or another psychiatrist. If they're on a very simple, straightforward antidepressant, SSRI, they've been doing well for a long time. What they really need is therapy, and they've checked in GHI and they've found the local clinician that they want to work with, but they don't necessarily need to see a psychiatrist. Sometimes they'll be able to use a family doctor here might be happy in terms of being able to prescribe a simple, straightforward prescription. Sometimes that's a little bit trickier. It really depends on what the situation is. I would say if ever, if something's not stable and hasn't been for a while, then it probably is worthwhile bringing on a specialist. If it's something that's been stable for many years and really they just need to fulfill their prescriptions, and often they'll be able to get it through one of the insurance. If it's AIM, there might be a doctor through AIM or someone who's connected to the school, a family doctor that might feel comfortable writing the prescription. So that's also a possibility as well.
Okay, so essentially there's, if I understand correctly, 3 possible ways to have your child's medication continue throughout the year. One is to send a full year's worth in advance. One is to send them shipments, every 3 months as they get filled in your country of origin and send them to Israel. And a third is to have a prescribing doctor in Israel. Does not necessarily have to be a psychiatrist. And if it is a stable situation, might very well be the medical doctor that is, sort of assigned to that. Most of the programs have a clinic or something like that where they tell people to go, whether it is to get a strep throat culture or this. That same person might be able to write the script for a continuing, stable kind of medication. Okay, and somebody asked about mailing medications in response to what I just said about sending a shipment. I do believe that could be problematic. I meant more if somebody from your community is going to Israel and you could send it with them and those kinds of things. But just from experience with having been asked that as somebody, oh, you're going to Israel, can you bring my child's medication? Just, to make sure that you're doing that well in advance enough so that it doesn't sort of become an emergency situation where they're missing their medication for a number of days, and to really kind of plot that out in advance.
I'll just say very quickly, Ravnon, because I don't want to take away from Tanya, just with regards to the medication, practically that is what's done. And a lot of people will send with family members or whatnot, or friends, medications. It could be that it's not 100% legal. Traveling overseas with medication into other countries, there will be, even though Israel, as far as I'm aware, does not enforce this, but could potentially at customs say, can you please show me proof that this is your medication, and that they could potentially cause a problem. But I've never heard of it being an issue. I'm not sure, Tanya, if you've heard of that being an issue here either. I think that's commonly what's done, but just to be aware in terms of the legality of it could be questionable, even if it's not actually enforceable. So,
okay. Having done that for people many times, this is the first time I've ever heard that it was a problem. So, okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, Tanya, if you can pick up then from where you left off. Thank you, Dr. Harris, for sharing that with us.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. Yeah. So one of the things I wanted to mention is, we talked a little bit in the previous session. Dr. Muscat mentioned that your kids might call you and, express some things on the phone to you. I would encourage you also, as you're sending them off, to just know what the local hotlines are here, because they might not feel comfortable calling you. They might not want to call the parents when they're really in a certain state. So we have a list of local hotlines here in Israel. The National Suicide Hotline, 10 for English. To be honest, I've heard reports in either direction that sometimes people dial 10 and they wait forever, and there really isn't an English, speaker on the other end. And sometimes there is one. So I would imagine that in these situations, if they don't have an English speaker answering the call here, they could probably even call the U.S. National Suicide Hotline just to be able to get through to an English speaker in those situations. But this is the Israel-based one where they would be able to then, direct them to safety if there was a need here on the ground. So this is definitely a page that every seminary and yeshiva student should just have access to. One more thing I wanted to actually mention that was important from the previous session that I heard and I didn't want to interrupt was the last question that came in about, how parents knowing how to respond and how to answer, certain kind of cries for help, so to speak. I would also say that you can use this resource to get guidance from a professional for yourselves. I've seen parents reach out to GHI therapists saying, "Can we do a family session with me and my child, or just me so I can handle what my child is going through in Israel. So that's also an option. If you really feel lost and unsure of how to handle the situation, we're here for you for that as well. If there's any search that you're doing on the site and you can't find what you're looking for, because not every English speaking therapist is on here, you really can't find what you're looking for, be in touch with us directly. We can get the information that you need. We can reach out to our network and they'll tell us who is the appropriate person to send you to. So we're kind of like the jumping point to where you need to be. So most of it will be on the site, some won't be, but we will make sure to get you what you're looking for. That's really important. If there are any, you also asked whether how knowledgeable or how equipped to handle are the seminaries and yeshivas to deal with certain mental health issues. One of the things that we do is we provide customized services and programs for gap year programs all over Israel of all religious denominations. If there's a need for us to really, get them a certain type of, or a group of therapists, after the Meron disaster, we got calls to get individual therapy for students who were on the scene. I was on the phone until wee hours of the night with different therapists, creating a schedule for the following day for the therapist to show up and meet with students at the drop of a hat. The requirement was very, very specific. They wanted female from trauma experts, and that was who are available the following day. And so we made sure to accommodate that need. So that is something that we are, a liaison between the programs and the therapists that they're looking for. Okay, now the other thing that we put out annually, this year we actually didn't because of COVID, is the Mental Health Resource and Guide, which is an actual printed publication. It is something that you all can download on your computer. You could see it here, download 2020 directory. So this is the one from last year. And this has pretty much everything that you're seeing on the site, but are you seeing this? It's showing for you?
Yes.
Okay, but it's in a PDF version. Everything is categorized by region. So if for whatever reason it was more convenient for you to, let's say find a therapist, print their, have a printed version of their information. It has all the treatment facilities and organizations and all of that. So it's like in a printed version, and as well as information on navigating the mental health system here. But that's more relevant to people residing here. So that's, in short, the use of the GHI resource. And like I said, if there's anything at all that is not here that you need, whether you're the parent or the school, reach out to us. The email is support@gethelpisrael.com. I can also put it in chat here. And we're here to help in any way that we can. This is one of the things that we're grateful to be that bridge to really allow people to access services in English. When you're in crisis, the last thing you want to be doing is doing the research. And if your kid's in crisis, so is the parent. You can't be doing that research from abroad. So just knowing where to turn and let us do the research for you and find what you need. We're very happy to help.
Okay, thank you so much. I have a couple of questions that came in that hopefully you can help us with. So one was about payment. If one is paying privately, as seems to be if you're using an Israeli practitioner, most of the time will be necessary. How do many of the practitioners accept payment? Do they require bank transfers? Is there some other kind of method of transferring funds which they tend to use?
That's an excellent question. Most of the therapists who work with clients abroad charge via PayPal. We are soon going to be incorporating into our site credit card processing. So you would be able to pay the therapist by credit card through the GHI site. That might take about a month. So if your kids are going to to yeshiva and seminary next year. Be'ezrat Hashem, by then it should be ready.
And do you know if some use Zelle or Venmo or other of those kinds of electronic methods?
So I believe with Venmo, you have to have a US account. And that's tricky for therapists. If they don't have a US bank account, then they can't use it. I have no doubt that there would be pockets of therapists that would accept it. You're actually giving me an idea. Perhaps we need to have a section, at least for those therapists who are going to have the gap year therapist badge, that there should be information on how they accept payment. And maybe that would make things easier for the parents who are searching.
Right, for sure. Okay, a couple of other questions, and since we just have a few minutes, try and get to them. So somebody asked whether there are psychiatric nurse practitioners in Israel that can prescribe, or if in Israel only doctors can prescribe.
Shmuel, I'll let you take that one.
Yeah, there are no psychiatric, they're not recognized. And I think it really touches on a little bit what Tanya was saying initially with regards to licensure and regulation in this country. It's still quite specific in terms of only doctors at this stage are able to prescribe, nurses not. And I think even in the US, sometimes there are therapists in certain states in the US that are even able to prescribe certain medications as well, that I heard of psychologists. But in Israel, it's still doctors.
Another question was asked about insurance, whether any of the practitioners accept the AIM medical insurance that students get, whether they cover any of the psychological or psychiatric services.
Not that I know of, but it would be worthwhile to ask them because I did speak to a few therapists who really work a lot with gap year students before doing this talk, because I really wanted to gather information from them. They did say that in very rare situations, they can just give like a detailed receipt as long as they, are licensed and all is in order with their licensing status, then it will be accepted. But it really is just dependent on the insurance. So if that's a specific insurance for students, it's something that should be discussed with them directly.
Okay.
Tanya, can I just add on to that from psychiatric? It's a little bit different. Sometimes you are able to claim back with US insurance for psychiatrists. I've had a number of students that have been able to do that successfully through their family insurance that they have back in the US, depending on what the level of coverage is for the specific student. There have been rare occasions that AIM has actually refunded back in certain circumstances when certain students came to see me. But my experience is it's more the exception than the rule in terms of the coverage, yeah.
I just got a comment that I do want to share. I'm sure Tanya will appreciate. Somebody who's sending their second child to a gap year is commenting that Get Help Israel is such a helpful resource, and that they're very excited that this resource is available now for their second child going for their gap year experience. I did get one other question, which I think actually I'll take a moment to address, and that is the question of sharing information with the seminary or gap year program or yeshiva. And this is something which I feel a little bit qualified to address, because although I'm here this afternoon, both as a parent and as the executive director of Refuat Hanefesh, my day job is being a high school principal. So I do really, see many of the different sides of this issue. And, my perspective on this is the following, that while it is true that in the past, there have been situations that some people have encountered where sharing that information with the gap year program did not end up going the way they wanted to see it go, and that sometimes some parents or some students found that to be a difficult or unhelpful process. I have been in touch with many Israel guidance counselors and many of the people in the programs in Israel. And I would say that uniformly, everyone is working really hard to make this system work better. And that these programs in Israel want to be helpful, want to get this information. and not a single one of them is looking to exclude students who have mental health concerns. And figuring out the best program and the best place for each child, depending on their exact needs, is certainly, can be a complex process, but that the motivation and goodwill is uniformly there across the board to try and, make what can be a difficult, a difficult situation as seamless as it is. I know that many of them are using the services of places like Get Help Israel, Machon Devir, Kav LaNoar, and others in order to help them get better educated about how to provide help and support in the best ways. That many of them, as Tanya mentioned before, have a slate of therapists which they recommend regularly to their student body. That, as Dr. Harris pointed out to us earlier, 25% of the students who are in gap year programs are accessing therapy, which means that if you do share that information that your child needs therapeutic help, that's not going to be something unusual to them. That's going to be something that they're experiencing with 1 out of every 4 of the students that they have in their program. As a parent, I can say, as I mentioned earlier, about reaching out to the mental health professional in one of the programs that one of my children went to. It was a very helpful engagement to really help us work through some issues that made a very big difference in our child's life. So overall, while nobody can ever promise you that by sharing information, once you share information, it's not private anymore. And nobody can ever promise you that that's going to go perfectly in all situations. But as a whole, I think that for all of us to move forward and breaking the stigma around these issues and creating communities of care together, that the gap year programs in Israel really are in general a safe place to share this information and work together with them to help care for your children. Okay, I forgot that somebody asked one other specific question, which maybe we can address, and that is if a parent, now a parent of a young adult who is now 18 and legally an adult, wants to have access to information about their child's care that they're getting while in Israel, what is the process for setting that up? Or what, is that possible? Or does the young adult, have the ability to make it so that the parent can't get access to that information from the provider?
At that age, it really is up to the young adult to give the parent access to that information. So even if the parent is funding the therapy, the therapist is bound to confidentiality unless we have consent from the client.
And I do know that some of the providers will present that choice to the, to the child. Well, I guess the point is they're not a child at that point, to the young adult at that, sort of in setting up the therapeutic relationship, and have a form ready for them to sign if they are comfortable having the therapist share information with the parent. And sort of that is part for many of the therapists of the intake process, discussing, that issue.
It is a way to share certain information while not compromising the confidentiality and the intimacy of the therapeutic relationship, which is essential in order for therapy to proceed. I mean, parents don't need to know everything in order, to feel comfortable with the therapy that's going on. We still want to protect that therapeutic space, but include the parents in some way as well. So it's not a binary yes or no. There's ways that can be navigated.
Okay. All right, I just want to close with one more thing before we go back to the main room. And this is really very firmly putting on my Refuat Hanefesh Executive Director hat. We have had many volunteers helping us put together this program, both volunteers on our staff, as well as the volunteer presenters, as well as some volunteer young people helping us put together all aspects of this program. We at Refuat Hanefesh hope to be engaged in a long-term engagement together with the mental health services in Israel, the gap year programs, the schools here in America, in continuing the conversation of how we can set up the best possible environment for students to thrive and be healthy while they're in Israel. And we are a small organization with a very small staff, and we do rely on donations and funding in order to be able to do what we do, and that will really help us move forward in this process. So I am sharing with you now 3 links. Our Refuat Hanefesh website, where if you are interested and willing to partner with us, you can make a donation specifically towards next year's program, which will go not just towards next year's program, but all of the work we're going to do in the interim to continuing this conversation with all of the different organizations, schools in America, in Canada, and the programs in Israel. You can also make donations on our Facebook page. And we are also part of a wonderful organization called mytzedakah.com, which allows people to use an app to set up a recurring payment schedule for a whole slew of different great organizations that they want to support, doing all kinds of great work in the Jewish community. And it's a way to kind of set up in advance your regular giving with maximal transparency as to what you're giving to, as well as maximal technological ease as well. So, while we absolutely are committed to continuing this process and making whatever services we provide available to all people free of charge, educational services, as well as the things we're going to do to help these organizations grow and develop and coordinate together with one another. In order to do that, we do need funding. And if you're in a position to help us, we really would appreciate that help. And with that, thank you so much to everyone for participating. Really a tremendous turnout. And I know that there were more than 100 people who were here, but we've also gotten so many emails about people asking about the recording of this program. We are going to be putting together the recording, editing together the different sessions and sending that out within the next few days to all of the people whose email addresses we have through registration. So you will get that, and hopefully you will continue to be in touch with us as we all work together to have a healthier and more open, transparent environment for all of us about these important issues around mental health in our community. So we can go back to the main room, and we will close very shortly.
Right off the bat, you should know that everybody here really wants what's best for you. And if you're a little bit creative, and you can probably get the help that you need while you're here. So I'm assuming that some of you might be having had pre-existing conditions or diagnosis in which you've been seeing a therapist for some reason or another. Some of you may or may not be taking medication. Some of you may be concerned that you're going to develop a diagnosis while you're here in Israel, and other people here will never develop a diagnosis and not need therapy. So I'm not assuming that you're all in one category. Truthfully, I'm not assuming that you're all in any category, and it looks like there's 12 individuals here. So if I had the opportunity to address each of you as an individual, that's really what I would do. So I want to start with a question that was asked because it wasn't really addressed by Dr. Harris, and let's just pick up with that. And then we'll get to more questions at the end. I've been a Rebbe, as I said, in yeshiva for over 20 years. When I first started as a Rebbe, I had a bachelor's degree in psychology. So I had some idea of what mental health looked like, but I wasn't a therapist and I wasn't trained at all. Most of the Rabbeim that you're going to have in different yeshivas are not trained therapists. Like Dr. Harris said, there's a growing awareness of mental health in this country, and there is a growing concern, and there's a growing willingness to direct people into psychotherapy. But at the end of the day, the Rabbeim are usually there to either guide you spiritually, or whatever other word you want to use, philosophically or theologically, or to help you grow up in your gap year while you're away. And your mental health might not be number one. There might not be their number one concern, and there might be things that they miss. So really, at the end of the day, you can be your best advocate. and you should know what's out there. You should know what you need. You should feel confident that there are places to turn to for help. Especially at the beginning of the year in Israel. When you come, if you're coming in August, if you're coming in September, at the beginning of the year, while you're getting adjusted to your surroundings, the Rebbeim are also getting adjusted to you. And you may go 1 or 2 or 3 months here before anybody really has a strong enough personal connection with you to approach you and say, hey, I'm noticing you're having this challenge or this struggle. So if you have some sense of what it is that you need, then you'll be better off. So that's one thing. Another thing is that schools and Rebbeim often have different standards. So Dr. Harris spoke a little bit about depression. He spoke about eating disorders. He spoke about people being comfortable with their body. I can tell you from the experience that I've had working with guys from all different yeshivas, all yeshivas are different. So there are yeshivas where you can sleep a lot and nobody will be bothered. There are yeshivas where if you spend a couple of days in bed, everybody's going to be concerned about you. So there really isn't one standard that all of the yeshivas have. The same thing goes for example, working out. Dr. Harris just mentioned it the culture of working out is different in different yeshivas. There are yeshivas where everybody's on creatine and everybody's drinking protein shakes and everybody's bulking up. And there are yeshivas that are not like that at all. There are yeshivas that are very focused on the football league. So if if you're a jock and you're into sports, you're more popular. And if not, you might not be so happy with yourself. There are all different kinds of yeshivas and all different kinds of standards out there. So if you have a pre-existing condition or you know something about mental health and you know what you're looking for, you'll be better off. And if not, then what you'll probably find is one staff member in your yeshiva who's the one staff member who has more of an awareness of mental health. And he may approach you, he may not approach you, but you'll probably find a staff member in every yeshiva to address your concerns. In addition to that, of course, there are clinics and hotlines throughout Israel where you can turn to get more clear information. So Eitan, what I'd like to do is just pause. I gave like a little introduction of some of the directions. I have a whole outline here, but maybe if there's a question or two that we can take that will direct us towards some of the content, that would be helpful for people.
Yes, thank you for pausing. So we don't actually have any questions in right now. So if anybody has them, definitely feel free to ask. It's totally anonymous and everything. And I apologize for calling you a doctor before, but it seemed like actually it was for a good cause because you were able to stress that you're not a doctor. So
yeah, it is a good cause, and that's why I'm asking for questions, because I'm assuming nobody's going to ask a question about something that's not already in the outline, because these are the general topics. Just like Dr. Harris mentioned, he covered actually most of the relevant information. So I'd rather address it to something that's actually here, to an actual person. Anybody? Somebody must have a question.
People definitely have questions. Okay, we've got a question. We have a couple of questions. So somebody would like to know, do yeshivas have school psychologists?
Okay, so let's jump back to the term doctor. I don't know. I know of one yeshiva who has a psychologist on staff. So just to get the terminology right, psychotherapist, which is the word that I use for myself, just simply describes what I do. I do psychotherapy, which means I sit in an office and talk to people. I'm not a doctor, which means I don't have a PhD. I don't have a PsyD. I'm not a psychologist, and I'm not a psychiatrist. I cannot diagnose illness or provide medication. There are some yeshivas who do have therapists on staff. Most yeshivas, I believe, do not have therapists on staff. So there are other issues that come up when yeshivas do have a therapist on staff, such as confidentiality issues, and are you comfortable talking to your therapist about private things that you don't want your Rebbeim to know or you don't want your parents to know. So usually I think what's currently like the main thing is that yeshivas refer people out to private therapy, individual therapy, in which case you meet with your therapist in his office. And then of course, if your therapist is a competent therapist and a professional therapist, he will tell you, and he will stand behind the boundaries of the therapy, which means that everything is confidential, unless, of course, you're planning on injuring yourself or somebody else, in which case there will be a different treatment plan.
Okay, we have another question in. To what degree should we trust the non-mental health professional staff at a gap year program to direct us in our mental health concerns?
Okay, so let's move into that. I think, in my experience as a Rebbe in yeshiva, in addition to people learning Gemara and thinking about their religion and maturing and being independent and living in a dormitory away from home and growing up, aside from all of those issues, a main level of development that people reach is who they can trust and who they can't trust. Much like in early stages of childhood development, one of the first things children learn is trust and mistrust. Who do you trust and who do you not trust? So I would imagine that in any yeshiva that you're going to go to, there are going to be some Rebbeim who you find to be more open, some Rebbeim who are more approachable, some Rebbeim who you feel closer to. And I think ultimately, if you're discussing something openly with one of your Rebbeim or one of your teachers, and he refers you to a therapist, at the beginning of whatever therapy you're going to have, it's important for you to know, I think, why your Rebbe is referring you to that particular therapist. I think this is something that I work here, as I said, as a Rebbe and as a therapist. When I work as a Rebbe in yeshiva, just to be very clear, I don't see any of those students from the yeshiva that I teach in as clients in psychotherapy. It's a completely and totally different relationship. So the students that I have at the yeshiva are the students who I teach Torah to. Those are the students who come to my house and hang out at my table and eat Shabbos meals with my family, and we go on trips together. I do not see any of those students for psychotherapy, because that would be bad therapy, that would be wrong, that would be unethical and unproductive. Psychotherapy is something that's different. It needs to have clear boundaries. And anybody in the yeshiva where I teach who I feel would benefit from therapy, I refer them to other therapists. When I refer students to therapists, I don't refer to one particular therapist. Depending on what it is that the student wants to accomplish in therapy and what I think his needs are, I might refer to a variety of different therapists. And I think, so that's number one. If you're going to have somebody in your yeshiva refer you to a therapist, I think it's important for you to ask, why this particular therapist? And then I think once you go to that particular therapist, I think it's important for you to discuss with that therapist what the goal of the therapy is. And so that you get a sense of how that particular therapist works and whether or not you feel comfortable with the plan he has for your treatment. In addition to that, I think Dr. Harris mentioned, and I mentioned a little bit earlier, there are different types of psychotherapists. Not everybody is a psychiatrist who is a medical doctor. Not everybody is a psychologist. Not everybody is a social worker. There are different letters at the end of everybody's name, and there are different types of therapy. But there are certain things about therapy that any therapist should do. And if any of the therapists doesn't do those things, those are red flags for you. So any competent therapist will talk to you about confidentiality, will talk to you about boundaries, will make sure that you feel cared for, will make sure that everything is explained to you so that you will be an active partner in whatever treatment that you have. So does that answer the question to a certain extent? I don't know who asked it, so I can't address you.
You addressed that very well. We have a couple more
Okay.
questions which came in. Do you want to do more questions now, or do you want to move on with?
Well, the truth is, Eitan, I mean, these are all things. I'm just gonna. So far, everything's coming off of my paper, so it doesn't really matter what order I go in. And as long as I'm answering questions, then I like to do it that way.
Okay, cool. That's good news because we've got questions. All right, so somebody asked, what do you do if you don't like your program after the first 2 months?
That's a great question. I don't know how much, when you say program, I don't know if you mean the school program or the therapy program.
It could be meaning the yeshiva or seminary program also.
Right.
So I guess I'll
I
let you
think,
go for it.
well, from where I sit as a teacher, as a Rebbe in yeshiva, I can only be an effective teacher if my students want to listen to me, and they will only want to listen to me if they like me. So if somebody doesn't like me as a teacher or like the yeshiva as a yeshiva, then I think it's really important that you bring that up with somebody on the staff and discuss it with them, because one of the risk factors, meaning one of the patterns that you don't want to get into, is just being isolated and unhappy and alone. When you're isolated, unhappy, and alone, you tend to make bad decisions. Israel can be a wonderful place. Israel can be a dangerous place in terms of the availability of drugs and alcohol, and so on and so forth. There's lots of dangerous stuff that you can get yourself into here. So if you're unhappy, talk to somebody on the staff. And if you don't find anybody on the staff to talk to, truthfully, there are hotlines in this country in English, and there are enough mental health professionals scattered throughout the country that if you do a little bit of networking, you'll find somebody and you'll get a number for somebody. But don't suffer in silence, and don't be unhappy for any long period of time. I think you should really reach out and talk to somebody. That being said, let me just quickly, I don't know if anybody's going to ask this, so I just want to mention it now. If you're in any kind of treatment from America, the actual law, I believe, in the United States for a licensed therapist is that they cannot provide international therapy over Zoom for you. So I think it's important for you to know, if you're currently in therapy, my guess is that your therapist in the US or wherever it is that he or she practices will not agree to see you over Zoom while you're in your gap year. So I think you can turn to your therapist, and you could ask your therapist to help you find another therapist. But it's important to have a therapist that you feel is working within the system, is working legally, and is allowed to do the treatment that he is providing for you. So I think that's important as well.
We do have another question which came in, and again, I would encourage people, any questions which you may have, you should definitely message them. They're very important questions. So another question which came in is, would a yeshiva possibly feel uncomfortable dealing with a student who might mention possibility of self-harm or suicidal ideation?
Okay, so let's talk about self-harm and suicidal ideation. I think it really depends on your yeshiva. I do believe I do believe that your yeshiva needs to take care of you. I believe that if you're somebody who's experiencing a certain level of suicidal ideation or self-harm, then the first part of your treatment plan is recognizing that people care about you. And in order for them to help take care of you, there are certain things that they need to do. So one of those, that would basically mean creating a treatment plan. So I can't speak for any of the particular yeshivot, but I do know that I do know a number of the yeshivot who work very well together with teams of psychiatrists and psychotherapists to help people get the help that they need. I think it's a transition year. I think you're socially, emotionally, philosophically, religiously, spiritually, it's a transition year. Lots of ideas floating around, new ideas, lots of new experiences, lots of exposure to new ideas and new people. So things come up. But again, if you're experiencing any type of distress, just reach out to somebody and speak to somebody. I know the organizations that are sponsoring this event. You can call them. I mean, I didn't ask them this directly, but I'm sure you can call them. And there are other organizations. If for some reason you don't get in touch with them, there's always somebody to call. You really are not alone. And I really think that the climate, the mental health climate in all of the yeshivot is changing, and has changed. And everybody does have an awareness of mental health and how important it is for people to feel like they can, talk about whatever it is that they want to talk about. I will just use this opportunity. This was not part of your question about suicidal ideation, but gender concerns have come up in recent years in psychotherapy as well. So don't suffer in silence from anything that you're suffering with. Find, it might take you a month or 2 or 3 or even 4 or 5, but really find somebody on that staff in that yeshiva who you can talk to openly. And be open with him, and he will probably find a way to get you the support and the help that you need from a professional therapist. Anybody else?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you said that, mental, because there's a lot of things when it comes to mental health which are unclear, but just objectively speaking, you're not alone. You have a lot of caring rebbeim, you have organizations to reach out to. I certainly encourage anybody to reach out anytime to Refuat Hanefesh, to me. We could help guide you along. So that's a really important point. We do have another question which came in, which is, how do you recommend navigating the drinking culture that might exist in a gap year program?
Okay, so I'm going to address that in 1 second, but first I want to just jump back to something else that I said a second ago. Because I'm a Rebbe in yeshiva and a therapist, and I'm able to navigate from both ends. The bottom line is I do wear this, and I do have a beard. So when people come to psychotherapy, very often they're inhibited by that, and people, they may have heard of me from a friend or from a colleague, or they just. And it's difficult at times to bring up issues that are embarrassing, or that they feel or you feel are religious issues. But because of my experience, I know the difference between a religious concern and a psychotherapy concern, and they're not always the same. So when I'm in my office working as a psychotherapist, I'm not there to provide religious guidance. I'm not there to provide religious advice. I'm not there to talk about what's right and wrong according to, your interpretation or your school's interpretation of the Torah. That's not my job. My job is to help you be a mentally stable and healthy, emotionally enough so that you could engage in whatever program that you're in. Drinking culture, it's a tough one. There's a lot of drinking here. There really is a lot of drinking. There's a dangerous amount of drinking. Let's be just very clear about it. I'll tell you some of the things that are dangerous. There's a dangerous amount of drinking. There's a dangerous amount of pill popping. There's a dangerous amount of self-medicating and sharing pills that are not prescribed. And there's a lot of peer pressure because it's your first time away from home. So again, don't feel like you are alone. Reach out to people to get help and get support for the struggles that you're having. In regard to medication, I think it's also important to know that if you are taking any medication for a diagnosis that you had from a physician in the US or whatever country you're coming from, you need to figure out how you're going to continue to get your medication prescribed. If that means bringing enough of it with you at the beginning of the year, or if that means setting yourself up in a way so that you can get prescribed medication here, I would definitely encourage that. I know people who do get their medication kind of on the black market or by trading and sharing with other people. It's really not advisable. Your year in Israel with time changes and with trauma that may exist politically and safety concerns, there's so much going on. It's really easy to fall into bad habits. So really, I can't stress it enough. Don't do it. On the other hand, you're teenagers. So I'm assuming you're teenagers. So the availability of alcohol, people do binge drink, and people do get themselves into trouble. People really do very dangerous and very dumb things. Most of you will not become alcoholics, but maybe according to statistics, one of you will. So, in every yeshiva, I've been in yeshiva for 20 years. So most of the people, most of the time, are mostly healthy. But some people sometimes are not so healthy. And it's a vulnerable time period of your lives. So, I would encourage you to use it well and to find people who you can trust to support you.
Yeah, it's such an important topic. Completely agree. I remember from my time there. We have another question which came in. What should I do if I see a friend who is having problems with mental health or substance abuse and isn't getting help?
Mhm. Well, the first thing that you can do is you can tell him or her that he or she is not alone. That's the first thing that you can do is you can be a good friend. Good friends don't ignore problems. Good friends try to get their friends help. So go to somebody, go to your friend and say, hey, it looks like you're going through a hard time. I really think it's a good idea for you to speak to, and then fill in the blank with whatever staff member in your yeshiva is the one who deals with that, and is the trustworthy one. Nobody should ever be alone. And I think, just think of it, you wouldn't want somebody pressuring you into doing something that you don't want to do. But if you're feeling like you're alone, then it's always comforting to know that you're not. So support your friends, pay attention to them. Of course, you're not responsible for them. The school is responsible for them. Definitely, I would say if you see somebody who's self-harming, get them help. You know, you're not bound by any laws of confidentiality as a friend. You know, your job is to, if you see somebody doing something dangerous, get him or her help. So call somebody or say something or raise that flag in the yeshiva. I can share with you stories that I've experienced in yeshiva where people were kind of sworn to secrecy and they wouldn't tell on their friends. And it's really not a question of telling on somebody. You know, I don't think, you know, if your friend has a vape pen and, you know, he smokes up on Shabbos, and, you know, you're going to go tell the Rosh Yeshiva and he's going to get thrown out. That's very different than, you know, your friend binge drinks and cuts himself. I mean, you have to be smart, and you have to know that there is such a thing as recreational drug abuse, and there is such a thing as recreational drinking, and it's a spectrum, you know. But if somebody's self-harming or somebody's really doing something dangerous, I think it's important for you to get that person the help that he or she needs.
Thank you. So we don't currently have any questions in, so I'm not sure if there's anything you specifically wanted to address.
Okay, I'm going to look over here on my paper. Okay, yeah, let's talk about the different standards, because I think that that's important. That every yeshiva kind of has different standards for success. There really isn't a universal measure of success in any of these yeshivot. So some yeshivos might stress, you know, going to class. Some yeshivos might stress going to davening. Some yeshivos might stress, you know, how you behave on a Shabbaton or on a trip. And because there really there isn't one standard. Sometimes it might be hard for you to kind of gauge where you're at. Some people, you know, Dr. Harris talked about anxiety disorders and people not feeling comfortable speaking publicly. Like, a lot of that has to do with the culture of the program that you're going to. So I have no idea, of course, what programs any of you are going to, but just pay attention to the fact that your programs are different. The expectations of your program are different. The styles of your teachers are different. The experiences and the ideas that you're going to be exposed to are different. And all that comes into play when you're talking about your mental health. So there are some basics that kind of guide you along, I think. And how many hours a night are you sleeping? How are your eating habits? How are you feeling socially? Those might be like three main concerns. Like, if your sleeping is messed up, or your eating is messed up, or you're just not making any friends and you feel lonely all the time, you know, try to get some help for that, because that could turn into something else, or that might be a sign of something else. And that's very different than, just to be, you know, that's very different than wondering if God exists, you know, like those types of questions of like, oh, I'm in Israel for the year, so, you know, I'm kind of wondering about philosophy or theology or God, or those are probably some of the reasons why you're here in the first place, and that's great and that's good. And those are not the kinds of explorations that should make you sad or isolated or lonely. Those are the types of explorations that could kind of invigorate you and make you interested. But if you find that they're making you isolated or sad or lonely or changing your eating or sleeping habits, so then maybe speak to a teacher about that, to try to see, hey, is this a religious issue? Is this a spiritual issue? Or is something else really, really going on here? So we do have, guys, we have about 6 or 7 more minutes. So anybody else? I see there's only one. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry about that. I do have a question for you. When would a student know if it's a matter for a school psychologist, or maybe a Madrig, which is kind of like a dorm counselor for those who don't know? A matter for one of them, or a matter for a rabbi? How would we know who the right person to go to is?
You trust yourself. You learn to trust yourself. That's really the bottom line of the answer. I know that might not be comforting, but again, follow the symptoms. Follow the symptoms. Like if you're feeling good or you're feeling confident and you just have questions throughout the day or night, so that's one thing. But if you're really not feeling confident and you're not eating or not sleeping, or you're angry all the time, or you're isolated, or you're self-injuring, or you're drinking, those are some symptoms. And I guess it's important also to state that psychotherapy is not a cure for everything all of the time quickly. If you're coming to Israel for a year, then and you're deciding you want therapy, or one of your teachers is deciding that you would benefit from therapy, you have to know what you're getting yourself into. Usually you're getting yourself into a process that will be weekly, for 50 minutes or 60 minutes, depending on how that particular therapist work. You will usually, or your family will usually be paying for it privately, usually, because usually I find that it's not covered by insurance. And then you're going to be developing this ongoing relationship with your therapist in which you talk. Now, if you have a very precise and particular issue that you need treatment for, that's one thing. But if you don't have a precise or particular diagnosis or set of symptoms, and it's something more general, then it might just take time. And if you're committed to that process, like Dr. Harris kind of hinted at, your gap year could actually become the basis for the rest of your life, in which case you have had a healthy relationship with your therapist, and you develop some tools and some skills for self-regulating and for monitoring yourself that you can build on for the rest of your life. That's something that happens a lot during a gap year. If you're coming for 1 year, sometimes people come back for a second year. They wind up going back to their therapist and continuing that therapy.
Thank you. Let's see, one more question, and we might need to close with this, depending on time. But what if a student is wondering, this is my year in Israel. Maybe I have something that should be addressed, but I can address it after the year, saying that this isn't the year it needs to be addressed. What would you say or recommend to that line of thinking?
So I think there's a spectrum. I think there are some yeshivot who say, I know of one yeshiva in particular where 90% of their students are in therapy. The approach of that yeshiva is to send everybody for therapy. And of course, at the opposite end of the spectrum, there are yeshivot who refer their guys out for therapy much less. I don't think everybody needs psychotherapy. I believe first and foremost, people are coming to Israel for what's called a gap year. So to mature socially, emotionally, spiritually, religiously. Again, these are terms that they don't even have a direct meaning. But that's really why people are here. So I don't feel that everybody needs to be here in therapy. I think if you're in a program, and I think every program has social and emotional support from caring teachers and madrichim. So I don't think everybody needs to be in therapy. So I think it really depends on your symptom and how you're feeling about yourself. If you're getting what you need in your yeshiva, then great, then wonderful. And don't be concerned. Don't overthink things. Don't worry about therapy. But if you're from that population who would benefit from it, it really is an available resource. And there are so many caring and competent therapists here for you to see that you should never have to go through something by yourself.
Okay, thank you. We have only a couple minutes left. Is there anything you want to close with, Mendel?
Yeah, I'm very encouraged by this. I'm very encouraged, first of all, by this endeavor of Refuat Hanefesh. I'm encouraged by the fact that, you know, we have a bunch of people here. I think my guess is that there are probably more females. What do we have here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 or so. I'm imagining we have more females. I'm not sure why that is, but I definitely encourage you guys to get the most that you can out of your year here. I've watched students come here and grow and change for 20 years, and it's amazing. I love what I do as a Rebbe. I love what I do as a therapist, and I really feel that if you could combine, if you can get what you need out of your year in Israel, it can be a really amazing experience that you could build your life and your future on. So that's really that's how I'm feeling right now. Just feeling very optimistic, and I hope you guys feel optimistic as well. And in case we ever bump into each other anywhere, feel free to say hello.
Okay, thank you so much, Mendel. Those were really insightful questions, and I know I gained a lot from them, and I'm sure everyone else here did. There's
Okay,
a quick
guys.
question. There's a quick question before you go. If you're comfortable sharing your email to the chat, so if somebody has a question.
Yeah, it's my name at Gmail. Mendel Horowitz at Gmail. I could put it in there, or wait, can I put it? Oh, I can. So.
You can.
Hello everyone, my name is Lauren Bahar and I'm the Administrative Assistant for Refuat Hanefesh. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Shalamis Pollack, a clinical psychologist who has been working with students for many years. Dr. Pollack made Aliyah almost 10 years ago from Eastern Texas, where she ran the guidance department in Robin and Barron Academy, a modern Orthodox school for ages 18 months to 18 years. Before that, she lived in Bergen, New Jersey, where she ran the guidance department at Mayan Yeshiva High School for Girls. In Israel, she worked in the public school system and as a private practice working with lots of individuals in Israel for the year. Shalamis is also a mom of 5. She lives in Beit Shemesh, and during her free time, she is the head of the behavior psych team for Camp Hask in New York. Welcome, Dr. Shalamis Pollack.
Have a realistic sense of what it is that you are going to potentially be faced with, some of the things that you're going to be excited about, and some of the things that might worry you, and to give you a bit of a sense for how to navigate the difference between the two. So excited for a fresh start versus when we can't leave our baggage on the plane with us. And some of the fresh start things that I have noticed that people in Israel are excited about are things like being independent, living away from home, making a new set of friends. Let's say I made Aliyah from Houston, Texas, which had a very small Jewish community, getting excited to be part of a much larger Jewish community in Israel or in a seminary or in a gap year program, wherever you're going. Being excited to change. Let's say I grew up in a fairly not observant home and excited now to go to a place where there's a lot of observance around me. So to be able to grow in all sorts of ways that are exciting. And then when we're talking about baggage that we can't leave behind on the plane, there are certain things that I think we would like to be able to leave behind us, and we're not sure if we can. And we'll go through some of the different categories today, but there are many more that I'm not going to mention, only because each person has their own stuff, or in Yiddish we'd say our own pekelach, our own little bags that we carry with us, and some of which we might be able to leave on the plane. So for example, if let's say I'm the youngest sibling and I have a house full of siblings that boss me around, and I come to Israel for the year, and all of a sudden I'm much more free and I'm much more independent to do my own thing. And the baggage of being the youngest who's always bossed around might be something I really can live on the plane. But if, let's say, throughout the last couple of years, I've suffered from a certain sense of depression. And I'm not sure whether that's the kind of thing that's environmentally based, where I can leave it on the plane, meaning my family dynamic won't follow me to Israel in the same way, or maybe my communal dynamic won't follow me in the same way, and the depression will lighten. Or it'll be the kind of thing that's a part of me. And while I thought maybe it would lighten by changing environments, it might not. So I want us to be prepared for the dynamic of being really excited for a fresh start, as well as certain things that we're going to notice we can't leave behind on the plane with us. Okay, building good habits. I want to start with ideas that are really helpful to us. These are things that some of them you're like, of course, this is good habits for wherever I go. And some of them are really specific for the living environments in Israel. The three basic ones that all grown-ups in your life have probably said to you a million times over again: eat well, sleep well, exercise well. They apply to your year in Israel absolutely the same way they apply to everywhere else in life. But there are a couple of things that I think apply specifically to your year in Israel. Number one, alone time. It is so exciting to be part of a dorm, to be part of a big program, to be part of a year in Israel. And we think about all the excitement parts of it. And sometimes we don't realize that this is going to be an experience with very little built-in alone time. As far as I know, none of the gap year programs give anybody their own room. If anybody is participating in a gap year program where they get their own room, wow, tell the world about it, you're lucky. But most of the time you are in a room with anywhere from 2 to, oh gosh, I've worked with some guys in yeshiva who are like in rooms with 10 people the size of like a tiny little closet in America. Like those who maybe have a walk-in closet could probably fit, I don't know, 10 beds in it if it was an Israeli dorm room. And so you're really crowded with sharing bedroom space, sharing bathroom space. Some of the seminaries have bathroom doors that don't even go all the way down. So you're not even having, excuse my crudeness, your own toilet space in that sort of way. It really is an experience where there's a lot of shared space and very little alone time. Oftentimes when you go away for Shabbos, you're so excited to get to a house, only to discover that you're sharing a bedroom with their 8-year-old and their 12-year-old, and maybe their 12-year-old's 3 friends that are sleeping over. So the idea of alone time in Israel is certainly not a given. And when we're talking about building good habits, you need to be able to balance all the fun of being social with the need for alone time that will not be built in and something that you're going to need to do on your own. So for example, if growing up in high school, going out to eat is like a mortal sin to do by yourself. Like I remember I was in graduate school, I was the only Orthodox person in my program. So we were 30 people in my year when I was getting my doctorate. And I was the only Orthodox person. And at the beginning, the thought of going out to the kosher pizza shop by myself was like horrible. That for the first 3 months, I went to Tony's Pizzeria with everybody and ordered a Coke. And they're like, oh, does she have an eating disorder? I'm like, no, I keep kosher. It's not an eating disorder. I can't eat anything you're eating. They're like, so why don't you go to the kosher pizza shop? I'm like, alone? Oh my God, I would never. And then finally about 3 months into it, when I got really hungry at lunchtime, I'm like, I'm going by myself if anybody wants to come. And I think they came with me once or twice and they saw the prices of the kosher pizza and they're like, we're going back to Tony's. And that was the end of that. But the idea of creating alone time is going to be very different your year in Israel, and you're going to need to make space for it. Be it alone for Shabbos, alone to go shopping, alone for a walk around the block. And that leads into being able to say no to somebody. So let's say there's somebody in your program who also is looking for a place for Shabbat and says, oh, Sherry, where are you going for Shabbat? And Sherry might say, oh, I'm going to my cousin. Hey, do you think you can bring me along? And you happen to really like this girl, Jessica, who's asking you, but you happen to really need alone time. One of the really good habits that you're going to need to learn your year in Israel to be able to say, wow, I'd really love to spend time with you, but I really need me time. And the ability to be able to say no. And here's the really important piece: to say no without an excuse. And to be able to say, it doesn't work for me, or this is not something that I can do this week. I'd be happy to try it another week. You don't have to feel like you need to apologize for creating me time and for setting boundaries for things like that. And the same thing with good habits, like maybe in high school when your friend wanted to borrow your favorite dress, it was so flattering. Oh my gosh, she likes my dress. It's so awesome. And 3 girls wanted to borrow it and you're happy to share it. It's possible in some you're going to feel like, oh my God, people are borrowing my clothing every day. It's a little much for me. So building good habits is also learning to be able to keep boundaries, to say to somebody, I really like you, but I don't want to lend out my dress. And not saying, I hope that's okay. And not saying, will you still be my friend? Just saying, it's not something I want to do. You could say, but I'd be happy to go out for lunch with you. Something like that, to be able to have the person know that you'd like to be part of their friendship. but not to go over things that don't feel comfortable for you. So again, building good habits, you want to be okay with alone time, create the alone time because it won't come by itself, the ability to say no and without an excuse. You can admit when something's hard for you in terms of building good habits. There are going to be lots of girls in your gap year program who have really different needs than you, things that are easy for them, different personalities than you do. And for some, something comes really, really easy, and for some people it doesn't. Building a good habit is being able to say, oh my God, that's awesome that sounds fun for you. That scares the living daylights out of me. I'm not sure I want to do that with you. So I remember my year in Israel, a whole bunch of us went rappelling or snappling, they call it in Israel. And it was like so much fun. And I remember there was this girl who came along with us who was like so excited to come. And then we got to the top of the mountain and she's like, I'm not going down. And I'm like, why are you not going down? She's like, I'm afraid of heights. And I'm like, okay, we've been planning this trip for 2 weeks and you didn't tell anybody you're afraid of heights? She's like, I felt stupid. And I'm like, oh my God, we're on top of a mountain and now you're telling us you're afraid of heights. And we all would have liked her just the same, I promise, if she would have said, yes, I really want to come with you, but I'm not sure I want to go rappelling. And we might have gone, I don't know, to the beach and gone swimming instead. So really, one of the building of good habits is being able to say when something is hard for you, or when you don't want to participate in something, or when you'd like to, but I'm really nervous. Can I go down first so that I know that everybody is still behind me, cheering me on? So that's part of building good habits, is really advocating for yourself. Okay, we're going to go to the next one. I'm such a fan of Dr. Seuss. The challenge to discover your year in Israel. What feels genuinely good to you? Today you are you. That is truer than true. There is no one alive who is youer than you. Seminary is a melting pot of girls and Jews from so many different kinds of places. And sometimes there is a pressure to all become the same person. And it's one of the things I see very often, I would say, when people come to see me as a psychologist the first 2-3 months of seminary. It's like everybody's doing X and everybody's doing Y. And I tried doing that for a while and it really doesn't work for me. I'm like, yeah, because that's just not you. And it's okay to be you and still be a part of things. But to be a part of things, you don't have to be like everybody else. And the truth is, very few people are like everybody else. It just doesn't feel that way when you're first there. If you think about sort of a Darwinian approach to like humankind, like humans evolved to fit the needs of the space that they're in at the moment. And humans survived by becoming a society. So if everybody had to hunt and everybody had to cook and everybody had to clean and everybody had to take care of babies, nobody would survive. So, you know, you had the man who went out hunting and you had the woman who then cooked the hunt. And then you had, you know, the other person in the family who took care of the household, so to speak. And it was a way to build a society where everybody had different roles. So think of yourself when you come to seminary as wanting to fit in, but not needing to fit in being exactly like your roommate or being exactly like the madricha, but being who you are and finding how you could fit in a very important role, but very much being you. I'll give you another example from making Aliyah from a place like Houston, Texas. In the summers, I spend my summer at Camp Hask, which is a New York-based camp, and my kids go to various day camps or sleepaway camps. And I remember when my kids went to this very New York-centered day camp, and they would say things like y'all and things like that. And I remember one of them practicing in the mirror, you all, it's not y'all, it's you all. And at one point I said to him, like, you could practice that all you want, but you're going to trip up 30 seconds later when you say something like fellas or whatever it is that is so different from all the New Yorkers. You might as well just figure out how to be Texan and how to be you within the context of who everybody else is, and find a way to fit in when you don't have to be a New Yorker, but you can be you in the context of everybody else. And it's not always easy, but oftentimes it's a much better approach when you stay true to you and then you find a way to fit in that way. Okay, the next slide that I'm going to show you is a little overwhelming. It's a couple of what I call differential diagnoses. So I'm giving you a little bit of a heads up that it's the most overwhelming of the slides we're going to do today. But I think it's really important to pay attention to the fact that there are things that are heavy, and there are things that look like they're heavy, but they're not quite as heavy. And then there are things that are so normal that even though we feel like they're heavy, they're really not. So without further ado, here we go, the overwhelming slide. Differential diagnoses, and I really should put the word diagnosis in parentheses here. Okay, so we're going to go through a couple of these. Homesickness or depression. I'll give you a great example. My grandparents made Aliyah in their 80s. They were like staunch Zionists. They met Aliyah with like their canes and their, you know, little shaking hands, and they were unbelievable role models for me. And I couldn't wait for my year in Israel when I would get to spend Shabbat and Chag at my grandparents. And it was like a 3-day Chag, I don't know if it was Rosh Hashanah or Sukkot, one of the first ones that I went to them. And after about 2 hours, I thought I was going to cry, and I held it in. And then after 3-4 hours, I'm like, I'm really going to cry. And after about 4 or 5 hours, I went for a walk, and I found a tree in the middle of a park by myself, and I bawled and bawled and bawled. And I remember saying to myself, okay, am I homesick? Am I depressed? What is going on here? And then I said to myself, Shalamis, you are from a family of 5 children. I'm the oldest, so I had lots of little siblings around. My first cousins lived very far away, and they went to school near my house, and they spent many, many chagim at my house. So my house had, at the very minimum, I don't know, 10, 12 people at every chag, and young people. And here I was with my 80-year-old grandparents, who did the meal in about 30 seconds and then told me that I could sit in the living room or go downstairs to the courtyard of their apartment building, and I couldn't go any further because it was dangerous, in the safest neighborhood in Yerushalayim. And I thought to myself, I can't spend 3 days with 80-year-olds with nothing going on, and the meal takes 30 seconds and I have nothing to do. And I've run out of conversation to have with my 80-year-old, very loving, but very boring grandparents. And I cried for about 3 days straight. And so the difference between homesickness and depression sometimes is a feeling that you're going to have, but I want you to know that being somewhere new can lead to homesickness like you've never had before. I was a kid who'd been to sleepaway camp since as young as I could go. My mom thinks I must have been 7 or 8 when I started going, and I wanted to go a whole summer, and I wanted to go the beginning of the summer, the end of the summer, the middle of the summer, whatever she would said before I wanted to go. I went on sleepovers for days on end, and never once thought about my parents, never called my parents unless I got in trouble if I didn't. So I did. And then I got to my year in Israel, and I was totally surprised by how homesick I was. I didn't realize that I had any attachment to my parents' way of singing Kiddush. If you would have asked me, I would have said I had no emotional attachment to that. And I cried for weeks on end when people made Kiddush in a way different from the way my dad did. These are ridiculous things that absolutely surprised me. And fast forward, I stayed 2 years in Israel, and then I did lots of independent things on my own. And it was not a long-term prognosis of, oh God, she's never going to be able to be alone by herself. It was homesickness. But that having been said, I also want you to know that sometimes people do get depressed, and around this age, college age, is when sometimes certain psychiatric developments start that didn't have much of a rooting beforehand. So it is possible that you have been happy, healthy, and well-adjusted, and that you may start to feel depressed at this age because there is some sort of biological underpinning to the depression. So I want you to be aware that homesickness happens. It surprises us often, and sometimes all it is homesickness, but it very well can be depression as well. So if you find yourself losing appetite, losing sleep, not having fun in ways that you normally enjoy yourself, if you find yourself removing yourself socially from people that you're normally involved in, you may want to come to somebody in your gap year program, or call a parent, or call a therapist that you know from home and say, I'm wondering if I may be depressed. Can I have somebody to talk to? Okay, number 2, shyness or anxiety. I am going to tell you that as a confident person, I'm going to use myself as a lot of these examples. I had no problem asking for things. I was never shy. I got to my year in Israel and realized, oh my God, I have to make Shabbat plans every week by myself. So let's say in high school, I think probably 8 out of every 10 weeks I was away at a friend's house. And when we were sitting next to each other in class, I'd say, hey, you want to spend Shabbat together? She'd be like, okay, let's do your house because last time we did my house. And then a third friend would hear and say, oh, no, wait, let's do my house because I have this really cute guy coming over. Come to me instead. My brother's friend is really cute, blah, blah, blah. And we would make plans, and it was so easy. I never thought that making Shabbat plans would be stressful for me. I came to Israel, and I remember my parents said to me, we have this really good friend. Her name is Rebecca. You can always go to her for Shabbos if you need. And I called Rebecca once to say, hi, how's it going? And I had a lovely conversation with her, but she didn't invite me for Shabbat. And then I called again a week or 2 later, and we had a lovely conversation, and she didn't invite me for Shabbat. And I think I must have called her 5 or 6 times before I realized, oh my gosh, I need to invite myself to somebody else's house. That is so not socially appropriate. That is so weird. You don't invite yourself somewhere unless you're invited. And it became a whole different social norm, and things that would have been so easy for me in terms of inviting myself places became really hard because it was a totally different task. So number 1, the kind of things that you're going to need to get over your shyness for in Israel are things that sometimes you have very little practice for in your high school life. So be aware that even if those of you who may never have been shy before find yourself being shy in Israel, there is a chance that it's because the task at hand is so different than what you've had to do before. And not only do you have to make Shabbat plans by yourself, in a lot of seminaries, you have like a night off. So you might need to make, I don't know, Tuesday night plans, and then Saturday night plans. And it's a lot of inviting yourself places. It's a lot of feeling out other people to see if you can ask if you can join. So there are 3 girls all going out together on Saturday night. And you're like, okay, here are their plans. They think I'm standing there and probably am playing on my phone, but really I'm listening to their plans and I'm saying, should I invite myself? Should I not? But if they wanted me to come, maybe they would have invited me, but maybe they don't know that I'm interested because they think I'm just, should I invite myself? It's so different than the typical kind of decisions you'd have to make in high school. So be prepared that you may find that you are really shy in a way that you have never been shy before. And don't be scared of that. Just know that this is a really new environment. And at the same time, know that anxiety may be kicking in a way that you've never had anxiety before. A, because this is a biological underpinning that you have and it's coming out now, or B, because you have to be social in ways that are so much more overwhelming than you've ever had to be social before. And by the way, just because you feel like you have some sort of social anxiety taking place here doesn't mean that you're going to have a miserable year at all. It might just mean that you need to say to a couple of friends, for example, I'm really anxious about Shabbat plans. Do you guys think that if you ever go somewhere as a group over the first month or 2 of school, that you would mind seeing if I had plans that week, because I might be shy and trying to make plans on my own? Would you mind if I tagged along once or twice? Or it might mean saying to a madricha, I have a really hard time, with Shabbat plans and Tuesday plans and Saturday night plans. Do you think that you can help me or connect me to some people who wouldn't mind having somebody along with them? So there are many ways to advocate for yourself, but know that the shyness can happen. Don't be surprised if it does. The social demands are very, very different here than they've been up until now. Okay, number 3, quirky or lacking social skills. I have a great example of a roommate that I had, not my year in Israel, but at another point in life. And I got undressed the first night in my, cute little pajamas. And she walks out of the bathroom in like a cute little nightshirt and her underwear and no pants. And the underwear are very much showing. It's not like a nightshirt that goes down to like her thighs. It was like an teensy weensy nightshirt. And I remember thinking to myself, okay, what's wrong? Either I'm like a real prude or she's really off, or we both come from 2 totally different cultural backgrounds. And like what she's doing is normal for her. What I'm doing is normal for me. How am I going to figure this out? And it took me a while in each of the different dorming situations and really in all different social situations to figure out what's the norm for where I am. And are there things that I need to learn? Are there social skills that I'm lacking? Or do I kind of just come from a really different culture and people are really different in different places? Or I'll give you another example. In Houston, nobody would dare to touch anybody's shopping cart in the supermarket. Like if somebody's cart is in the middle of the way, you wait till they finish choosing their Cheerios and then you let them move their cart. Or you find them 3/4 of the way down the aisle. You go to them, hey, excuse me, ma'am, I'd love to get by, but your cart is blocking. They'll say, oh, I'm so sorry. And then they'll go back and they'll move your cart. Their cart. If you move their cart, it is considered so rude that you touch somebody else's shopping cart. And in Israel, if I were to go and tap somebody and say, oh, slicha, your cart is blocking me and I'd love to be able to get through to the applesauce, they're going to look at me and say, what, you don't have feet? You can't move my cart by yourself. You have to bother me. Can't you see I'm choosing Cheerios? And it's a totally different cultural norm. So you're really going to have to get used to asking yourself, like, is there something I need to learn? Is there a social skill that I need to tighten up? Am I quirky? Is the person I'm with quirky? Or is there something else going on here where we have different social norms? So be prepared for any of those as a possibility. Okay, teenage fears versus poor body image. I have a great story to tell you. When my kids were young, I had a lot of little kids very fast. And my husband and I were in very much the parenting stage, very much to the exclusion of taking care of ourselves stage. So it was like I had, to be honest with you, 3 little kids in 1 year. My daughter was born in January of that year, and then I had twins that were born in December of the same year. So I became a new mom of 3 kids in the same calendar year. It was a very crazy time in my life and for my husband. And I have 0 recollections from that year. Thank God there were pictures because I know nothing of what happened. I didn't sleep much. I didn't eat much. And I totally neglected myself. And at some point, my husband and I went on a vacation together. And the first place we went, we heard of these like really pretty private beaches in Deal, New Jersey. And it turned out a private beach didn't mean we had our own beach. It meant that it was a beach you just have to pay a lot of money to get onto. And we go onto this beach and everybody is perfectly tanned and sculpted and looking gorgeous and well exercised and well fed. And I remember my husband and I thinking to ourselves, we are the two ugliest people on the entire planet. And we felt awful about ourselves. Now, thank God, day 2, we went to Sesame Place. And Sesame is a place of all these middle-aged grown-ups who all have bellies all over and pimples all over their face, and nobody's brushed their hair, and who knows when they last showered, and they look like real people. And my husband and I were like, oh my God, thank God we're human like everybody else. And we felt so good about ourselves. So it is possible that you're going to come to seminary or your gap year program and be surrounded by 1,000 teenagers who are all self-conscious, and everybody is trying to look really good and to only show the parts of themselves that are glamorous. And you're going to feel like, oh my God, I am so, and fill in the blank, whatever it is that you're self-conscious about. And it's possible that it's just a very normative part of being surrounded by tons of girls your own age who are all struggling with wanting to only show their best foot. And eventually that will fade when you realize that everybody else is human and everybody's got the stuff that they're self-conscious about. But it is possible that there's something going on with your body image, and that the more you are away from home and the more you're surrounded by other girls, you're going to notice that certain things are not normative. So for example, if everybody else around you is totally comfortable getting undressed before you go swimming, and you're the only one who won't get undressed in front of anybody, and you're so afraid that they're going to notice, I'm giving an example, that you have, a belly, or you're so afraid to take off your makeup before everybody else falls asleep because you're afraid that they're going to see your complexion, or whatever it might be. This is a time in your life when you have an opportunity to compare yourself to what the norm is your age, and to realize if there really is a poor body image, this is a really good time to think about trying to figure out, do I need some help? And sometimes comparing yourself to others is a really bad idea, but sometimes it's an opportunity to develop a sense of what's normative, and how you can really be able to notice when something is not right, and get help. Okay. Let's do picky eater versus an eating disorder. I worked with a young adult a little while ago who, when she got to seminary, was absolutely flabbergasted that there were girls who would talk to their parents while they were eating seminary food. And she said to me, I realized there was something off, because I thought that if my mom ever saw me eating seminary food, she'd be really angry at me, because my mom always told me how important it was to only eat non-fattening, non-carb, non-this, non-that kind of food. She goes, and then I would see girls like drinking sodas, and it would be in their screen when they were talking to their mom, and she could see a soda, and I would say, don't you want to hide that before your mom sees it? And they would be like, what? Your mom knows you drink soda? And they're like, what? And she said to me, oh my God, I realized that I've been growing up in a family environment where I think we all have disordered eating. It was her first time being in an outside of home environment. Even school is different, because when you go to school, you bring a lunch in the middle of the day, nobody really pays attention to whatever happens. But you're eating breakfast, dinner at home, your main meals are at home. This was her first time out of her home environment, and realizing that there was something very abnormal about her family's eating culture, about the way her mom, her siblings related to food. And she noticed that other people don't have that same unhealthy relationship with food. So it's very rare to develop an eating disorder here in Israel when you have no background in disordered eating, but it's not uncommon to notice that something is disordered here in a way that it might not have come to light in your previous life. So pay attention to it. If you feel like something is off, really ask for help. There's a lot of great people in this country that can help you. Okay, breaking gender norms versus concerns about gender and sexuality. When different people come from different family backgrounds, from different cultures, from different religious backgrounds, there are very different norms about what's considered acceptable and non-acceptable, how gender conforming people need to be. So for some people, coming to Israel is very freeing. They're able to be much more fluid than they had to be, like in very specific roles that they might have been in at home. For some people, it's the opposite. They come from a very open background, and all of a sudden they're doing something and it's really strange in the current environment that they're in. Gender norms, cultural norms really vary between backgrounds. But one of the things that's really important for me as a psychologist when I talk to young men and women your age is for them to know that there are certain gender norms and certain sexuality norms that people consider to be the norm, but that in reality it's much more fluid than that. And people might often feel like I've always been X or I've always been Y, but I have feelings that are not so X or Y always, and I'm worried about them. And going to a dorm and being in very close contact with lots and lots of people sometimes really raises a lot of angst about some of the fluidity that people feel or experiment with. So number one, know that you're not alone if you're not typical in your boyhood or your girlhood or in your heterosexuality. Know that there's a lot of fluidity out there these days, and know that there are a lot of people you can talk to about it if you feel stressed about it. Feeling a little bit fluid or not typical in a certain way doesn't mean you have a problem, but if it's stressful to you, or being in seminary around lots of girls your own age who are all very typical and you feel atypical, if it feels stressful for you, there are lots of people that you can turn to ask for support. And for some people who have always felt okay with it in their home lives, going into a dorm where they feel like people are watching me or people are nervous about me. Or for example, I worked with a young woman who identified herself as bisexual, and it was never a problem in her home life. And she felt like she was in a dorm, and people kind of knew that about her. And she was worried that girls might think she was attracted to them, and maybe they wouldn't want to be in a room with her, and they'd be worried to room on a stool with her, and became something very, very stressful. So new environments can bring up stressors about things that we've been okay with up until now, or the opposite, things that we haven't really had the courage to deal with up until now. All of a sudden we're away from home, and this is a time that we feel like we're ready to deal with issues that have been worrying us or sitting on us, and we're ready to start to deal with them. So this is a time in people's life where these issues often come out. The last one for this is growth versus flipping out. This is something toward the middle or end of the year that comes up a lot. And that's the idea of I'm changing. And is changing a good thing, or is changing, oh my God, people are going to look at me and they're going to think that I have flipped out, you know, she's fresh off the boat, and all of those kinds of things that people say about everybody coming back from the year in Israel. And my only, advice to you is to sort of use this question. Do I feel like I'm moving towards something that feels beautiful and happy for me? Or am I running away from something? If I'm running away from something and I'm flipping out by running away from something towards something different, chances are I'm only doing something that's going to hurt me in the long run because it's not taking care of what's going on underneath. If I'm moving towards something that feels beautiful to me and joyous, and it brings me lots of satisfaction, go ahead and flip out if that's who you want to be, and enjoy it because it brings you joy. Okay. Hold on, I'm going backwards. Okay, here we go. What are some common red lights? Things that alert you that there is a problem going on. There are very, very common ones, and there are less common ones. The most common ones are if you notice that you're having problems with eating, sleeping, breathing problems, stomach aches and headaches, but usually around social kind of situations or about new situations, then it's time to say, I may need some support. Something doesn't sit right with me. That might not just be a simple adjustment, and I may need some more support. Excuse me, there are some other smaller kinds of red lights out there, and they're unique to each person, and each person knows what some of their own symptoms are when that happens. Like some people might say, I get really bad backaches when I'm really stressed about things, or I know for me that when I get really stressed, I can't think clearly. There's always like befuddling in my thinking. Everybody has their own little idiosyncratic things, but the big ones, you're not eating well, you're not sleeping well, breathing, stomach aches, headaches, things like that around social situation. Those are times to be able to say, I think I need some help. I think I need some support. Okay, coping mechanisms. These are a couple of quick ideas that are usually very, very helpful for your year in Israel. These are coping mechanisms that are available to you while you're here, while you're alone, while you're in a new environment. Number one, you have friends to speak to, teachers, parents. That's clear, and you'll be able to hopefully use those resources wherever you are. Set goals when you're in a new environment. If you feel like you are stressed, you want to be able to say something like, okay, I want to work on becoming more socially comfortable. In which case you're going to say, I'm going to set a goal for myself of making one new friend, or I'm going to set a goal of asking one person if I can join them for something, or I'm going to set a goal of sitting at a lunch table and not getting up until the meal is over, even if I'm feeling self-conscious that I don't know everybody at the table. So you set a goal and set sort of mini goals within that goal. And usually that's a really good coping skill when you feel like a job or a task is pretty big and it's pretty new. You can keep a gratitude growth journal. I know it's something that's very in, like in the Musar movement. Let's say people at night do a Cheshbon Hanefesh. Cheshbon Hanefesh sort of involves the good and the bad things of the day. There's so much research out there about gratitude when it comes to growth. Like when you wake up in the morning, come up with 3 big things that you're thankful for. Al haboker, first thing in the morning. Or when you go to bed at night, 3 things that you feel like you feel good about that you accomplished that day. When you're in a really new environment like seminary and things feel stressful, sometimes our brain has the capacity to zone in on the stressful parts and not on the parts that we're really grateful for. So pay attention to the fact that you're creating time for gratitude and to appreciate growth and things that have come easy for you. I want you to be able to find time for yourself for things that are alone time that feel good for you. Meditation is one, mindfulness. There's an amazing app. I think right now they have 30% off. It's really worth investing in, called Headspace. Those of you who haven't tried it, you can try it. I think they have 10 sessions for free. I want to say it's like $50 a year. They have like a little button where you can do 3-minute, 5-minute, or 10-minute meditation. Things like that just help to keep you in a calm space within yourself. They help you to realize that there's so much of you, not just small places within you that you're stressed about, but so much of you that can help you in a lot of great coping skills. In terms of coping mechanisms, just a couple of really bad ones out there. Relying on friends too much, drinking. I know that in the presentation beforehand, they talked about that the drinking age in Israel is 18. If you choose to handle problems that way, you will find lots of available venues, although most of your one-year programs will kick you out if they figure it out. But there are people who turn to things like that. Excessive online usage. If you're, a really big, Friends fan and you love to watch an episode of Friends before you go to bed, that's fine. But if you find that you're watching 6 or 7 episodes in a row and not wanting to go to bed or not wanting to go down to the lunchroom and everybody's eating, excessive online usage could be a sign that you're trying to cope, but you're not coping well. And here's a big one, and it's somewhat controversial out there. So if any seminary teachers are listening, don't shoot me. But excessive learning. There's a lot of people who cope by throwing themselves into the learning. And it really is a way of not dealing with whatever's going on underneath. So if you notice yourself, the last one in the Beit Midrash, all the time, constantly, and it's not bringing you joy, ask yourself if that's an unhealthy coping mechanism for you. Okay, find the helpers. Mr. Rogers, who's an old time television show guy, used to always say that in times of stress, find the helpers. And in times when things are not going well, look around for people who can help you. But not all help is created equal. Just know that when you're away from home, there are going to be things that are going to surface for you. Maybe there are things that have never been issues for you before, and maybe these are things that you will have difficulty in processing now for the first time, like you've had loss or anything like that. Just know that there are helpers. There are so many helpers out there. Not everybody's created equal. If you turn to the first teacher and they're not able to help you, see if there's a guidance counselor at the school, see if there's a madricha, see if there's somebody out there that can really support you, because in every situation, no matter what you're going through, there are people that can help.
We just wanted to close by saying the following, is that it's really our goal to continue to bring together all of the different people who are stakeholders in the gap year in Israel environment, those programs in Israel, which are so wonderful in providing amazing services besides all of the learning and Israel connection and other things that they offer to their students, making sure that their students are healthy and well cared for in every kind of way, not just their mental health. The schools in the United States and Canada that we partnered with, which have put so much effort into helping their students find the right opportunities for them after they leave, and are so invested in making sure even once those students become alumni, that they are involved in caring for them, looking after them, and making sure that their children are well taken care of, their alumni are well taken care of in the next stages of their development. And so many wonderful organizations in Israel, Get Help Israel, Machon Devir, Kav LaNoar, as well as other organizations, in Israel, putting so much effort into making sure that mental health needs are no longer in the shadows, are things that we talk openly about, are things that we recognize are part of the life of every person, that every person, just like they have physical health needs, they have dental health needs, they have mental health needs. Those people who are mentally well and healthy have mental health needs. Those people who have illnesses or disorders have mental health needs, and that by talking about these things together, our community only grows and gets stronger. And we at Refuat Hanefesh are very much committed to continuing the process of this conversation and making sure that there is absolute communication and interaction, collaboration between all of the different partners in the Jewish community in helping our young men and women grow up, as well as the stakeholders themselves, the young men and women here with us today who are going next year, and the young men and women who are here with us today who are recent alumni. All of those stakeholders continue to have a voice in helping us to build a healthier community together. So thank you so much to everybody for participating. And again, wish everybody who is going to be in Gap Year next year to have an amazing experience and a healthy one. And together we'll make sure that that's a reality. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you for joining us.